I went to visit my son, expecting nothing more than a quiet afternoon together, but he insisted we stop by a cafe first. While he stepped outside to take a call, the owner suddenly grabbed my wrist, his voice low and urgent. "Your son doesn't come here for coffee. He meets someone in the back alley every morning. See for yourself." I left the steaming cup of coffee behind, quietly left my seat, and followed my son's back into the damp alley behind the shop. 10 minutes later, everything I thought I understood began to change. Before we go further, thank you for being here. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It always means a lot. Just a quick note, parts of this story are creatively adapted, and any similarities to real names or locations are entirely unintentional. The smell of burnt espresso usually grounds me, but today it felt like a warning, the first structural flaw in the perfect polished lie my son had built around my life. I am Desmond Sterling, a 70-year-old retired bridge inspector who spent 40 years identifying the hidden fractures that make structures fail. I never expected the most dangerous crack to be in my own son's heart. I sat at the far end of the counter at the Rusty Bean, my fingers tracing the deep, honest grain of the mahogany bar. It was a stark contrast to the cold white marble that dominated Julian's mansion, a house so sterile I felt like a specimen under glass. My son calls it a smart home, but to me it feels like a high-tech cage. I am not even allowed to touch the thermostat. Julian claims the climate is optimized for my health, yet I have never felt more chilled than I do in his living room, surrounded by furniture that costs more than my first mortgage but offers no place to actually rest. My retirement was supposed to be a quiet span across the river, but Julian has turned it into a curated imprisonment. He treats me like a legacy asset he's trying to preserve, yet he never looks me in the eye long enough to see if the foundation is still holding. I shifted on the wooden stool, the familiar ache in my back, acting as a reminder of the real world outside this zip code of manicured lawns. Caleb Henderson, the 48-year-old owner of the Rusty Bean, wiped down the mahogany counter with a hand that still bore the scars of his early days in the Merchant Marines. He moved with a heavy rhythmic grace, the kind earned through years of hauling lines in gray Atlantic swells. He caught my eye and paused the wet rag resting on the wood. Another morning in the showroom, Desi asked, his voice low enough to slide under the hiss of the milk steamer. I managed a tight smile. "It's a house, Caleb, not a home," I replied. He nodded, knowing exactly what I meant. A bridge doesn't collapse all at once. It groans in a language only those who built it can understand. I have spent my life listening to those groans, hearing the way steel tires under the weight of too many winters. And lately, the house Julian built for me has been screaming. Caleb didn't offer the usual gossip today. Instead, he leaned over the counter, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over my empty ceramic mug. There was a tension in his jaw I hadn't seen before, a nervous energy that felt out of place in a shop that usually breathed with the slow tempo of a Saturday morning. He pulled the carafe from the machine and refilled my cup, but his eyes were darting toward the front window, watching the street as if he expected a storm to break. "Desmond, your son. He's not just on a business call out there," Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the grinder. I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck. "He's been coming here every morning for a week, but he never stays for the coffee. He meets a man in the back alley, a man who looks like a walking funeral, expensive black suit, eyes like flint." Caleb leaned in closer, and I could see the faint sheen of cold sweat on his palms. I heard them yesterday when I was taking out the trash. He's meeting a shark named Thorne. Silas Thorne. They were talking about the Elm Street deed Desmond. Julian was selling the floor right out from under my boots. The name Silas Thorne didn't mean much to me, but the way Caleb said it with a shudder that moved through his entire frame told me everything I needed to know. My house on Elm Street was the only thing I had left that was truly mine. The place where Annette and I had raised Julian, the place where every scratch on the doorframe was a chapter of our history. I sat there, the bitter taste of dregs in the bottom of a ceramic mug coating my tongue. My mind raced trying to find a structural reason why my son would be discussing my home with a man like Thorne. Caleb reached out his scarred hand, briefly covering mine. "My mother never forgot what Annette did," he said, his voice thick with a sudden gravity. "When the Merchant Marines sent me home, with nothing but scars, it was your wife who kept my family afloat. She brought over groceries when we were too proud to ask. She paid for my daughter's medicine and told us it was a loan she never intended to collect. Neither did I forget Des. That's why I'm telling you this. Thorne doesn't negotiate. He liquidates. He's a scavenger who picks over the remains of men who have lost their way. And right now, Julian looks like he's wandering in the dark. I looked at Caleb and saw the debt of gratitude written in the lines around his eyes. It was a humbling moment. Have you ever looked at your own blood and realized you didn't recognize the DNA? I stared at the reflection in my coffee, wondering how the boy I taught to respect the strength of a well-placed beam had become a man who traded in shadows. Caleb pulled back his eyes, returning to the back door of the shop. He reached into his apron pocket and produced a folded napkin, sliding it across the mahogany toward me. There was a time scrawled on it in hurried ink. He's meeting him again, right now. In the back, he said. The air in the shop suddenly felt too thick to breathe the smell of over-roasted espresso beans turning acrid. I didn't finish my coffee. The steam was still rising as I stood up my old joint, screaming that I was about to walk into a storm I couldn't navigate with a cane. I felt the weight of my 70 years as I turned toward the exit, my heart hammering a rhythm against my ribs. I wasn't just an observer anymore. I was a man standing on a failing structure, and I had to see the crack for myself before the whole thing fell into the black water below. The damp brick of the alley felt like ice against my palms as I pressed myself into the shadows, watching the man I had raised plead with a shark in a slate-gray suit. I had stepped out of the coffee shop with the steam of my abandoned espresso still ghosting in my lungs, my old knees popping with every careful step. The transition from the warm, mahogany-scented interior of the shop to the gray gloom of the alleyway was a shock that cleared my head better than any caffeine ever could. I moved behind a row of rusted green dumpsters that smelled of wet asphalt and rotting trash, a visceral reminder of the filth that usually hides behind polished storefronts. My son Julian was standing 10 feet away, his silhouette outlined by the weak morning light. He wasn't the confident executive I saw at dinner, the one who talked about high-frequency trades and venture capital as if they were personal conquests. Here in the damp shadows, he looked like a shivering subordinate, his shoulders hunched and his hands fluttering nervously as he checked his watch for the third time in a minute. Standing across from him was Silas Thorne, 52, and dressed in a slate-gray suit that blended into the skyscraper shadows. He stood with the terrifying stillness of a man who owned the air you breathed. Thorne didn't need to shout to exert power. His silence was a heavy, suffocating thing that made Julian look smaller with every passing second. I watched as Silas Thorne leaned forward, the hum of his luxury sedan, idling at the mouth of the alley, providing a low, mechanical growl to the scene. I realize now that Julian isn't the high-flying owner of the firm he's been boasting about for years. He's just a frontman, a groomed face for Thorne's money-laundering operations. The realization hit me harder than any physical blow. My son, a man I had taught to appreciate the structural integrity of truth, was nothing more than a cosmetic veneer for a criminal. How many coats of expensive paint does it take to hide a structural crack that runs all the way to the bedrock? Julian began to speak, his voice cracking under a pressure I could feel from 20 feet away. I need more time, Silas, he pleaded, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. My father he's stubborn. He doesn't understand the way the market moves now. Thorne didn't move an inch. Friday, Julian, he said, his voice a cold, flat blade. I don't want excuses. I want the deed to the Elm Street property. Or everyone finds out your venture is just a hollow shell. If that house isn't on my desk by the weekend, I will strip you to the bone and leave you for the collectors. Julian nodded frantically, his face pale as a ghost against the dark brickwork. Watching my son grovel brought a sharp, jagged memory back to the surface. It was only 2 weeks ago that I first arrived at the Naperville mansion, a place that felt less like a retirement home and more like a laboratory. I remembered walking through the front door, the heels of my shoes clicking against the stark white marble that looked like it belonged in a surgical wing. There were no family photos on the walls, no scuff marks from a life lived, just digital displays showing stock tickers and weather patterns. Elena Sterling, 36, and perpetually viewed through a smartphone lens, was arranging a $20 salad as if it were a museum exhibit, her eyes never leaving the screen. Smile for the camera, Desmond, she had chirped. Without even looking at me, her voice as artificial as the lighting. People love the caring for the elderly aesthetic. Julian had stood beside her, boasting about the smart tech security and the automated climate control. It's about the brand, Dad, he told me, with a dismissive pat on the shoulder. You wouldn't understand the digital economy. The mansion didn't smell like a home. It smelled like a hospital waiting room, a place designed to keep the occupant comfortable while they waited for the end. I had felt like a relic being stored in a climate-controlled vault, a piece of the past that didn't fit the new shiny aesthetic of Julian's manufactured success. I snapped back to the present as the sound of a heavy car door closing echoed through the alley. Silas Thorne had entered his sedan, the tinted glass reflecting the gray Chicago sky, as the vehicle glided away with a quiet, expensive hiss. Julian stayed where he was, leaning his forehead against the damp brick wall. For a moment, he looked as if he might collapse, his breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I stood in the dark, my heart aching with a grief that felt more permanent than the one I carried for Annette. "I'm sorry, Annette," I whispered into the collar of my coat. I didn't see the rot until it reached the foundation. I realized then that my son wasn't just a failure in business. He was a predator who viewed me as a resource to be consumed, a piece of collateral to be traded away to save his own skin. The rain began to fall not as a cleansing shower, but as a cold weight that made my old municipal jacket feel like a suit of lead. I watched Julian pull out his phone, his thumb tapping the screen with a frantic energy. He put it to his ear, and even from my hiding spot, I could hear the cold steel in his tone as he spoke to Elena. "The old man is at the coffee shop," he snapped. "Start the transition. We can't wait for him to sign anymore. Just get the files ready." He didn't look back as he walked toward his own car, his footsteps heavy and uneven. I stayed in the shadows long after he was gone, the cold from the brick wall having seeped through my jacket and into my bones. They weren't waiting for my signature anymore. They were preparing to take it by force, and I had exactly 3 days to find the one thing Julian had forgotten I possessed. I wasn't just a retired inspector with a cane. I was a man who knew how to find the hidden fractures in any structure, and before Friday came, I was going to find the crack that would bring Julian's entire hollow world down around his ears. My fingers gripped the handle of my cane, the wood feeling solid and real in a world made of glass and lies. I would go back to that marble-clutched mansion, and I would play the part of the confused aging father until the moment was right to pull the pin. Walking back into my son's house felt like stepping into a refrigerated vault. Everything was perfectly preserved, expensive, and entirely devoid of life. I kept my hand steady on the handle of my cane, the wood offering a tactile honesty that the rest of this foyer lacked. I had spent the last hour in a damp alleyway witnessing a betrayal that should have broken me, but instead it had sharpened my focus. As the heavy front door clicked shut with a sound like a hydraulic press, I adjusted my expression. I needed to be the Desmond they expected, the aging father, whose mind was starting to fray at the edges like an old rope. I let my shoulders slump just an extra inch, and allowed my gaze to wander aimlessly across the vast expanse of white marble that made the entryway look like a high-end mausoleum. I could feel the invisible eyes of the house on me. This smart home, Julian's pride and joy, was more than just a collection of thermostats and automated lights. I had recently discovered small pinhole lenses embedded in the recessed lighting internal cameras that allowed Elena to monitor my movements under the guise of elder safety. Every shuffle of my feet, every sigh was being fed into a digital cloud so they could track the speed of my decline. They weren't protecting me. They were measuring the time left until they could take my home without a fight. Elena was in the great room, bathed in the artificial glow of 3 professional-grade ring lights. She was in the middle of a curated organic photo shoot, holding a bundle of kale as if it were a religious relic. "Desmond, you look a bit lost, dear. Perfect. Stand right there in the natural light." She chirped, her voice skipping over me without an ounce of genuine concern. She didn't wait for an answer. She stepped forward, her fingers smelling of expensive unscented candles, and adjusted my collar. She wanted me to look more vulnerable, a slightly disheveled prop, to enhance the aesthetic of her selfless care. "I just went for a walk, Elena. My head... It gets a bit heavy sometimes," I murmured, trailing off into a vacant stare. She nodded distractedly, already checking her reflection in the camera lens. "Have you ever looked at a bowl of fruit and realized every piece was made of wax? That is what life in this house has become. Everything looks succulent and ripe for the world to see on a screen, but if you try to take a bite, you find only the cold, hard reality of plastic." I excused myself and shuffled toward the kitchen, making sure to drag my cane slightly across the marble floor, a sound I knew would irritate her polished sensibilities. I entered the kitchen and stood by the island, staring at the stainless steel refrigerator. It was a monolith of cold perfection, its surface devoid of the family photos, grocery lists, or magnets that usually define a home. There was no clutter here, no evidence of a life actually lived. Julian's idea of a kitchen was a laboratory for clean living, filled with artfully arranged vegetables he never touched, and juices that looked like swamp water. "A house is supposed to breathe, Annette. This place just holds its breath," I whispered to the empty air. I thought of the woodshop we had built together at our home on Elm Street. Every scratch on those workbenches told a story of a project completed or a lesson learned. There the wood felt warm because it had absorbed the sweat of our labor. Here the marble felt like a tombstone, sapping the heat from my palms. Julian wasn't my son anymore. He was a broker, and I was the stock he was waiting to liquidate. I watched the digital clock on the oven pulse with a silent, rhythmic green light, counting down the minutes until dinner, when I would have to face the man who had traded my past for a temporary reprieve from his own failures. Julian returned home an hour later, the sound of his electric SUV in the driveway barely a whisper. When he walked into the dining room, the air seemed to thin. His eyes were bloodshot, the whites of them mapped with tiny red veins that betrayed the jittery energy I'd seen in the alleyway. He was trying to play the part of the successful provider, but his movements were jerky, his smiles too wide and too brief. We sat down to a dinner of overprocessed salad and some form of steamed white fish that tasted like nothing at all. The clink of silverware against fine china sounded like the ticking of a countdown clock in the oppressive silence. "We're so glad you're here, Dad. We just want to make sure you're secure." For the long haul, Julian said, his voice straining for a tone of fake sentimentality. I watched his pupils dilated with a cocktail of greed and fear as he glanced toward the stack of mail by the door. He was hunting for the deed, waiting for the moment to strike. "The long haul is a lot shorter when you're 70. "Julian," I replied, keeping my voice firm but reflective. I used my starched linen napkin to dab at my mouth. The fabric was so stiff, it felt like I was wiping my face with a sheet of cardboard. I noticed Julian's hand tremble as he reached for the wine decanter. It wasn't just the nerves of a liar. I caught the glint of gold and sapphire on his wrist, a high-end luxury watch that hadn't been there this morning. It was a heavy, vulgar thing that screamed of a recent desperate purchase. I realized then that the transition Julian had mentioned in the alley had already begun. He had likely liquidated one of my smaller assets or taken a high-interest loan against his own reputation to pay Silas Thorne a temporary bribe. He was drowning, and he was using my legacy as his life raft. As Julian stood up and raised his glass, toasting to family, I caught my own reflection in the polished marble of the table. The overhead lights cast shadows across my face, deepening the lines of my 70 years. I didn't look like the victim he thought I was. I didn't look like a man whose mind was fading into the fog. I looked like a man who had inspected enough failing structures to know exactly where to place the charges. I looked like a man who was about to burn the showroom down, and as the wine touched my lips, I knew the 3-day countdown had officially started. Julian didn't even wait for the wine to settle in our glasses before he produced the leather folder, a black heavy thing that landed on the marble with the finality of a coffin lid. The resonance of the strike seemed to vibrate through the table, unseating the hollow warmth of the dinner toast. My son cleared his throat, a sharp practiced sound that acted as a curtain raiser for the performance he had been rehearsing in his head. I sat back, keeping my expression neutral, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. I was still Desmond Sterling, the man who had spent 40 years looking for the small, invisible fractures that precede a collapse, and right now, the air in this room was thick with the scent of a structure under too much stress. Julian flipped the folder open, and the smell of fresh printer ink rose to meet me, mingling unpleasantly with the aroma of the flavorless salmon. He began the pitch with a rapid-fire sequence of corporate buzzwords that felt like they had been scrubbed of all human meaning. Growth, legacy, risk mitigation. They tumbled out of his mouth in a rehearsed cadence designed to overwhelm an elderly mind. He spoke of autonomous wealth management and AI-driven investment projections, pointing a manicured finger at high-gloss charts that featured aggressive neon green lines spiking toward the top of the page. "This is the future, Dad," he said, his voice rising with a frantic sort of enthusiasm. "It's an exclusive tier of venture capital. It'll make sure you never have to worry about a bill again for the rest of your life." I watched his eyes, noticing how they darted to the dining room doorway every time a floorboard creaked in the hallway. He wasn't looking for a ghost. He was looking for Silas Thorne, as if expecting the man to burst in and demand a progress report. "I've never been afraid of bills, Julian," I replied, my voice calm and reflective. "I've only ever been afraid of debt. It's a weight that bends a man's spine until he forgets how to look at the horizon." Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly, leaning in closer. "Have you ever seen a man drown in silk? It's a lot quieter than the ocean, but just as final." That was what I saw in front of me, my son draped in his expensive suits and living in a house of glass, gasping for air, while trying to pretend he was a captain of industry. He flipped to a page featuring a complex diagram of interconnected nodes. The AI projections on the paper looked like a cardiac monitor spiking with greed flatlining on truth. I leaned forward, squinting at the fine print at the bottom of the page. That was when I saw it. The venture capital logo in the header was slightly pixelated at the edges, a telltale sign of a home-printed forgery. He hadn't even bothered to get professional documents. He had likely mocked this up in his home office an hour before dinner, desperate to create a paper trail that looked official to a man he believed was too senile to notice a digital blur. Elena stopped her social media recording, the red light on her phone finally clicking off, and joined the table. She acted as the voice of reason, her tone dripping with a manufactured sweetness that made my skin crawl. She touched my hand with a manicured finger that felt like a needle, cold and sharp. "Think of the peace, Desmond," she murmured. "No more leaking roofs at the Elm Street place. No more yard work or worrying about the taxes on a property that's clearly becoming a burden. It's about tranquility." She spoke of my heritage as if it were a rusted anchor dragging behind a yacht. "The orchard doesn't feel like a burden when the apples are ripe, Elena," I said, looking her directly in the eye. "It feels like a promise kept." She didn't flinch, but her grip on my hand tightened ever so slightly, a physical manifestation of her impatience. They were a team, a pair of scavengers trying to pick the meat off a legacy they hadn't helped build. Julian flipped to the final page of the folder. There at the very bottom was a single stark blank line next to my name. He emphasized that the entry into this high-tier portfolio required liquidity, the kind of liquidity that could only be achieved by the immediate sale of the Elm Street estate. "It's a $4.5 million opportunity," Dad Julian said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Most people wait their whole lives for a door like this to open." "A door that opens usually means someone else is closing one behind you," I countered, feeling the weight of the moment. He wasn't asking for my blessing. He was asking for the keys to my soul for a sum he had already spent in his head to settle a debt with a shark. I could hear the sound of his foot tapping rhythmically against the floor under the table, a frantic, desperate beat that gave away the terror hidden behind his corporate mask. Julian reached into the pocket of his silk blazer and produced a fountain pen. It was a beautiful instrument, heavy and expensive, crafted from black resin with gold accents. He unscrewed the cap with a flourish and handed it to me, waiting with bated breath for the signature that would finalize his theft. The pen felt as heavy as a lead pipe as it touched my palm. I looked down at the cap, and my heart skipped a beat. Embossed on the gold crest of the pen was the same intricate entwined logo I had seen on Silas Thorne's cufflinks in the damp shadows of the alleyway. Julian was handing me the very tool Thorne had given him to gut me. I held the pen over the paper, the gold nib trembling just a fraction of an inch above the line that would sign my life away. The silence in the room became a physical weight pressing against my eardrums as I stared at the blank space where my name was supposed to go. The gold nib of the fountain pen caught the chandelier light, a tiny glittering tooth, ready to bite into the only legacy I had left. But my hand didn't move, because a bridge inspector knows when a structure is under too much tension. I stared at the blank signature line, letting the clock on the mantel tick away the seconds of Julian's patience. The silence in the dining room was so absolute, I could hear the hum of the climate control system and the frantic, shallow rhythm of my son's breathing. He and Elena were leaning in their shadows, stretching across the forged documents like predatory birds waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. Julian's hand, still outstretched, began to tremble. I took a slow breath, noticing for the first time that his expensive charcoal gray suit jacket had a small telltale dry cleaning tag from a budget wholesaler tucked near the cuff. It was a pathetic crack in his polished veneer. He was literally wearing his last remaining assets to maintain the lie. He wasn't a mogul. He was a man playing dress-up in a house built of glass and borrowed time. The realization didn't bring me joy, only a cold, sharp clarity. I slowly set the pen down on the marble table. The gold-crested cap made a soft final sound against the stone. "I don't sign what I don't understand, Julian," I said, my voice calm and low. "And I understand this even less than the last time we spoke." Julian's face didn't just fall, it transformed. The mottled red of suppressed rage crept up his neck, staining his skin until he looked like a man on the verge of a stroke. The composure he had spent all evening maintaining finally shattered, revealing the raw, jagged desperation underneath. "It's a simple signature, Dad. Why are you making this a federal case?" he barked, his voice cracking. Elena tried to step in her manicured fingers, reaching out to pat my hand, but I pulled away. "Desmond, please," she said, her voice having lost its honeyed social media tone. "We just want you safe. There are deadlines." Her eyes darted to the window, reflecting a fear of that Friday deadline Silas Thorne had promised in the alley. I looked at them both and saw only the hunger of people who had run out of other people's money to spend. I stood up from the table, my joints aching, but my spine straight. When did my son start looking like a man who was drowning in shallow water, I wondered. There was a time when I looked at him and saw a future I could be proud of, but that bridge had been washed away by a flood of greed I hadn't seen coming. I walked toward the library, the heels of my shoes clicking, with a deliberate steady rhythm on the marble. They followed me, Julian's breathing now, a ragged, angry sound behind me. The library was a room filled with leather-bound books no one in this house ever read, a graveyard of knowledge used as a backdrop for Elena's digital performances. Julian shoved the heavy oak door shut, the sound echoing through the sterile halls. He didn't want the staff to hear the collapse. He turned to me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "Fine," he spat. "If you won't sign the papers, I need the watch. The vintage one. My grandfather's watch." He claimed he needed it for a legacy photo shoot, but I saw the lie before it fully left his lips. He wanted to pawn it to pay a late fee to Thorne. "That watch is a tool, not a fashion statement," I said, my voice firm. I felt the cold steel band against my wrist, a weight that had guided my father through 40 years of inspections. "It stays with me." Julian let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You're being selfish, Desmond. That watch is part of the Sterling brand now. It belongs to the estate." The air in the library was thick with the smell of old paper and new lies. I could see the sweat beading on his upper lip. He looked at my wrist with a longing that was almost physical, a man convinced that one more piece of my past could save his hollow future. A metaphor for his entire life, trying to use the strength of the foundation to shore up a roof that was already falling in. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I stood there like one of the stone pilings I had spent my life certifying, watching the storm break against me. Julian lunged. It wasn't the calculated move of a businessman. It was the desperate scramble of a cornered animal. For a second, the successful son disappeared entirely, leaving only a frantic man clawing at my arm. His fingers, soft and unaccustomed to labor, gripped my sleeve, trying to wrench the watch from my wrist. I felt the adrenaline of decades of manual work surge through me. I didn't hit him. I didn't have to. I simply planted my feet and pushed back with the coordinated strength of a man who knows how to move heavy loads. He stumbled back, his expensive shoes sliding on the polished floor, and fell against a shelf of unread biographies. He sat there gasping for air, his hair disheveled, and his pride in tatters. "Don't ever put your hands on me again, son." I said, the words falling like lead weights into the silence. "I'm the one who taught you how to stand. Don't make me be the one to teach you how to fall." The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the moments before a dam finally gives way. I looked at him and realized the bridge between us was officially out. There was no patching this fracture. I turned and walked out of the library, the sharp click of the door closing behind me, sounding like the final bolt in a coffin. I didn't look back at the man on the floor, but as I reached the shadows of the hallway, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked back at the library door and saw the red recording light of Elena's phone vanish into the darkness. And I knew the next trap wouldn't be on paper. It would be in my own head. She hadn't been trying to stop the fight. She had been documenting it, waiting for me to show a flash of temper or a moment of physical strength she could twist into a narrative of elderly instability. They were done trying to convince me. Now they were going to try to erase me. Anger is a structural load I can no longer afford to carry. To survive this house, I have to stop being the inspector and start being the ruin. I retreated to my guest room, my heart hammering against my ribs with a frantic rhythm I had to master. As I closed the door, I realized with a jolt of cold clarity that there was no lock on it. Julian had designed this sanctuary to be entirely transparent, a place where privacy was a luxury I was no longer permitted to possess. The air in the hallway smelled of chlorine, from the mansion's heated pool, a sterile chemical scent that seemed to underscore my own vulnerability. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, my ears straining for any sound from beyond the wood. Soon enough it came, the hushed, jagged whispers of Julian and Elena. "He is getting harder to handle, Julian." I heard Elena hiss, her voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. "We need those papers signed before the meeting." I know, Julian replied, his voice heavy with a desperation he could no longer hide. "Just let me think." Listening to them, I realized my defiance in the library had backfired. As long as I remained sharp, as long as I stood firm, like the bridges I used to inspect, they would see me as an obstacle to be dismantled. To win this war, I had to stop fighting. I laid back and stared at the ceiling, thinking of Annette. Decades ago, she had dragged me into a community theater project, laughing as she taught me how to project emotions I didn't feel. I had been a terrible actor then, a man too grounded in concrete and steel to understand the fluidity of a performance. But as I lay in the dark of my son's house, I realized those lessons were the only tools I had left to save my life. A man in my position has to learn that a blank stare can be a sharper tool than a carpenter's chisel. I began to practice the slackening of my jaw, the slight glazing of my eyes the way a person looks when they are searching for a memory that has already turned to smoke. I had to become the very thing they feared and desired, a mind in collapse. By the time the morning sun began to bleed through the designer curtains, I was no longer Desmond Sterling the inspector. I was a man lost in the fog of his own history. I made my way to the kitchen, making sure to stumble slightly as I crossed the threshold. Julian was already there nursing a cup of black coffee while the fan of his laptop whirred like an overworked heart. I stood in the center of the room, looking around with a manufactured confusion. "Julian, did your mother say when she'd be back?" I asked, my voice thin and wavering. I wanted her to see the garden. I watched Julian's face. For a heartbeat, there was irritation, the habit of a son who expected better of his father. But then I saw the shift. A flicker of predatory interest ignited in his eyes, a spark of hope that his problems were about to solve themselves. "Dad, Mom has been gone for 8 years, he said, his voice dropping into a tone of mock concern that made my stomach churn. "You know that." I let my hand tremble as I reached for the counter, leaning on the cold marble for support. 8 years, I whispered, rubbing my temples. "No, that can't be right. We were just talking about the harvest." I saw the greed in Julian's eyes bloom like a fungus. To him, my confusion wasn't a tragedy. It was an opportunity. I moved toward the cabinets, opening one, then another, then closing them with a frustrated sigh. "Where are the mugs?" "Julian, I can't find the mugs." I had used those same mugs every morning for 2 weeks, but now I stood before the shelves as if they were a foreign landscape. Elena entered the room, then her eyes widening as Julian gave her a subtle, triumphant nod. She walked over and touched my shoulder, her fingers cold and possessive. "Don't you worry about a thing, Desmond," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We're right here to take care of everything." I looked at her, letting my gaze drift past her shoulder. Is it Tuesday, I thought. For sure it was Tuesday. I asked the question again 10 minutes later, and then once more, as Julian poured me a cup of coffee, adding an overly sweetened artificial creamer that tasted like chemicals. "It's Wednesday, Desmond," Julian said, exchanging a look of shared victory with Elena across the breakfast table. It was the look of 2 wolves watching a deer begin to limp. They were already celebrating my descent, believing the bridge was finally failing. Have you ever had to mourn your own mind just to keep your soul intact? It is a lonely kind of theater. I sat there sipping the cloying coffee, watching them relax into their overconfidence. They began to speak over me as if I were a piece of furniture discussing their plans with a sloppy disregard for my presence. As Julian leaned over to comfort me, his hand resting on my arm, with a weight that felt like a shackle, I noticed him reach into his laptop bag. He subtly pulled out a second identical set of papers. He wasn't going to wait for my signature anymore. He had a backup plan, something that would likely involve a doctor's note or a power of attorney, fueled by the very performance I was giving him. My heart hammered, but I kept my face vacant. They thought I was losing my way in the fog of my own memories, but they didn't realize I was the one creating the weather. I was the ruin they wanted, and soon I would be the collapse they never saw coming. The moment the electronic lock on the front door chirped its finality, my spine straightened with a crack that felt like a bridge truss snapping back into place. I stood in the center of the great room, the fog I had so carefully projected over my eyes evaporating instantly. For the last 24 hours, I had played the part of the fading patriarch, a man whose memories were fraying like old hemp rope. They thought I was losing my way in the fog, but they didn't realize I was the one creating the weather. I listened to the steady hum of Julian's electric SUV as it pulled out of the driveway, taking my son and his performative wife toward their next high-stakes deception. Only when the silence of the mansion became absolute did I allow myself to move. I didn't shuffle. I didn't lean on the walls for support. I walked with the silent, measured efficiency of a man who spent 40 years inspecting structural shadows, looking for the cracks that everyone else was too busy to notice. Being perceived as senile has made me essentially invisible in this sterile fortress, and invisibility is a powerful tool for an inspector. Over the last 3 days, while I was supposedly looking for my lost slippers, I had been planting small voice-activated recorders in the decorative alcoves and behind the designer vases. I had 3 bugs running now, capturing the hushed whispers that Julian and Elena thought were private. I confirmed they were gone by checking the smart home app on my tablet, a device I had accidentally learned to navigate while feigning total confusion with the television remote. The house was mine for the next 4 hours. I felt a surge of cold empowerment. "I'm not the one losing my mind, Julian," I whispered to the empty marble-clad air. "I'm just the only one actually using it." My first stop was the office, the heart of Julian's hollow empire. Being a ghost in your own home has its perks. Ghosts can walk through walls of lies. I entered Julian's workspace, a room that smelled of ozone from the server rack and the cloying scent of his expensive cologne. It was a space designed to intimidate, filled with awards for ventures that I now suspected were nothing more than cosmetic shells. Luck was with me. In his haste to meet the Friday deadline imposed by Silas Thorne, Julian had left his secondary laptop open on the heavy mahogany desk, one of the few real pieces of wood he had kept from our old life. The screen was dark, but the power light was blinking like a nervous pulse. I sat in his ergonomic chair, my fingers hovering over the keys. I didn't need a hacker's skill to get in. I knew my son's vanity better than he did. I tried the name of his first dog, a golden retriever he had cried over for a week when he was 10. The password clicked. The desktop materialized a chaotic sprawl of spreadsheets and encrypted folders that Julian clearly thought were beyond my comprehension. I navigated straight to the private browser history, my eyes scanning the URLs with clinical precision. How does a man wake up one day and decide his father's life is just another chip on the poker table? The answer was splayed across the screen in sickening detail. Julian hadn't just made a few bad investments. He was a regular at an offshore site called Veritas Betting. I opened the most recent tab and felt a jolt of horror. The live balance was deep in the red, a digital wound that refused to clot. I scrolled through the transaction history, my breath hitching, as I saw a series of frantic high-stakes losses totaling over $200,000 in just the last 48 hours. Julian wasn't a businessman in a slump. He was a desperate addict trying to gamble his way out of a grave he had already dug. He wasn't trying to build a legacy with the Elm Street property. He was trying to pay off the house's mortgage of blood before Thorne decided to foreclose on his life. The laptop screen glowed with a sickly green light, casting Julian's debts across my face like a toxic shadow. I felt a wave of disgust so potent it made my hands shake. 4.5 million wouldn't save you, Julian, I thought, staring at the scrolling red numbers. You'd just double down on the apocalypse. He was ready to sell the house. Annette and I had built the house where he took his first steps, just to stay at the table for one more losing hand. I began to download the logs to a secure drive, but a notification popped up in the corner of the screen, an email from Silas Thorne. The subject line read, "Final appraisal of the Sterling Trust." My blood turned to ice. I opened it and found a PDF attachment. Julian had already scanned and submitted the trust documents to Thorne's legal team without my knowledge, likely using a digital signature he had forged from my old municipal records. He hadn't even waited for the performance to end before he sold the theater from under me. I stood up, the blue light of the monitor reflecting off my glasses. My eyes felt dry, my heart heavy with the finality of what I had discovered. I wasn't just fighting a greedy son anymore. I was fighting a man who had lost all sense of structural integrity. A man who would let the whole bridge collapse just to see if he could catch a falling coin. I closed the laptop, making sure it looked exactly as he had left it. The clicking sound of the keyboard in the otherwise silent house felt like the last bolts being hammered into a coffin. I needed more than digital evidence. I needed the physical reality of his desperation. As I turned to leave the office, I heard a strange rhythmic rattling sound coming from the kitchen down the hall. It was a small sound, but in the silence of the mansion, it was as loud as a structural groan. I headed toward the kitchen, my mind already calculating the next move, in a game Julian didn't even know I was playing. He thought he was the architect of my demise, but he had forgotten that I was the one who taught him how to read a blueprint. The foundation was rotting, and it was time to see just how deep the decay went. Digital debts are ghosts that haunt a screen, but the physical weight of a final notice is a structural load that no foundation can sustain for long. I closed the laptop in Julian's office, the click of the lid sounding like a gavel, and followed that strange rhythmic rattling into the kitchen. The mansion was too quiet, a sterile vacuum that seemed to amplify every small sound of rot. I found the source in the massive kitchen island, a slab of marble so cold and polished it looked like a mortuary table. One of the deep lower drawers was slightly ajar, and as the central air kicked on, the draft caused a loose stack of papers inside to shiver against the metal sliders. I pulled the drawer open, expecting to find menus or instruction manuals, But instead, I found the graveyard of Julian's success. Shoved to the very back, bound by thick straining rubber bands, was a massive cache of unopened envelopes. You can polish the marble, Julian, but you can't hide the smell of a fire. I whispered, my fingers hovering over the haul. I reached in and pulled the first bundle out. This was where the truth lived, hidden in the one place an influencer lens or a high society guest would never think to look. I sat on the floor, my back against the cabinetry, and began the grim task of archaeology. A man's life can look like a skyscraper from the street, but the basement always tells you if it's going to stand through the night. The first envelope I opened was a credit card statement with a balance of $52,000, the minimum payment alone more than my monthly pension. I moved to the next, a second mortgage notice on this very mansion, 3 months past due, with a threat of foreclosure stamped in a mocking, cheerful purple. I did the math in my head with the practiced precision of an inspector. The interest penalties alone were eating Julian alive, a geometric progression of failure that he was trying to outrun with a limp. Then I found the heavy hitter, a demand from a private lending group for $850,000. $850,000. That's not a loan, that's a ransom. My son wasn't just struggling, he was being liquidated by inches. I felt a cold sweat break across my brow as I realized the scale of the collapse. He had built a life on the edge of a cliff and was now trying to use me as the anchor to stop his fall. How much does a soul cost these days? In Julian's world, it seemed to be exactly $850,000. I dug deeper into the stack, my hands shaking as I found a glossy brochure tucked between 2 past-due utility bills. It was for Shady Oaks Assisted Living. My heart skipped a beat when I saw my own name scrawled on the reserved line for the smallest, cheapest unit they offered. It wasn't just a brochure, it was an intake plan. Julian wasn't planning for my comfort. He was measuring me for a room with a bolted door. The entry twist felt like a physical blow to the solar plexus. He intended to move me into a facility the moment the Elm Street money cleared, ensuring I was out of the way, while he used the remains of my life to patch the holes in his. I stared at the bright artificial smiles of the seniors on the cover, realizing that to my son, I was no longer a father. I was just a deed with a heartbeat, a problematic asset that needed to be managed and then stored. I moved to a smaller bundle of mail, these ones addressed to Elena. They were cash advance notices, high-interest bridges used to fund her charity influencer events. She was just as complicit and desperate as Julian, her entire persona, a cathedral built out of cardboard and credit. They were 2 scavengers picking at each other's bones while they waited for me to die. The envelopes were red. The ink was red. My vision was starting to turn red too. The betrayal was so complete, it felt structural, a failure of every weight-bearing pillar I had tried to install in Julian's character. I found one last letter at the bottom, bearing the logo of a legal firm representing Apex Private Equity Silas Thorne's company. The language was clinical and lethal. It explicitly mentioned the Elm Street property as the only viable collateral remaining to prevent immediate asset liquidation. Thorne wasn't just a lender, he was the foreman of Julian's demolition, and he was coming for my house to settle a debt I hadn't signed for. I felt a crushing weight in my chest as the full picture finally solidified. Julian didn't want me to retire in peace. He needed me to drown so he could use my home as a life raft. He was ready to throw me into a budget nursing home and pave over Annette's orchard just to keep his hollow showroom for another month. I stood up, my joints screaming, and began to meticulously slide the letters back into the drawer. I placed the rubber bands exactly as they had been, erasing any sign of my presence. I slid the drawer shut with a click that sounded like a hammer cocking on a pistol, because now I wasn't just defending my home, I was going to war for my life. I stood in the silent kitchen, looking at the vibrant, expensive surfaces that hid so much rot, and I knew the act of the confused old man had to become even more convincing. I wasn't just an inspector anymore, I was the demolition expert. As I turned to leave, a tablet on the counter began to vibrate, a new notification light, blinking like a signal fire. It was time to see what Elena was telling the world while they waited for me to break. The tablet on the counter buzzed like a trapped hornet, and when I swiped the screen, I found the digital knife Elena had been sharpening behind my back. I stood in the silent kitchen of the Sterling mansion, my pulse a steady clinical beat that belied the fire in my chest. Elena had left the device unlocked, a sign of the overconfidence my senile performance had gifted her. I navigated through her apps until I found her public social media profile. There it was, posted only an hour ago, the photo she had taken of me, looking lost and disheveled by the window. The caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive cruelty. "It's so heartbreaking to see a strong man become a shadow," she had written, followed by hashtags for dementia, awareness, and family first. She painted herself as the heroic caregiver, a saint burdened by the slow erasure of a man she barely knew. I scrolled through the comments, a tide of pity from strangers who praised her strength and lamented my decline. But as I dug deeper into the settings, I found the true rot. Elena had enabled ad revenue on the posts featuring my simulated confusion. She wasn't just building a public record to justify committing me to shady oaks. She was literally profiting from the image of my broken mind. "I am not a shadow yet, Elena. I'm the one holding the flashlight," I whispered, the high-pitched electronic whine of the notifications sounding like a countdown. How much of a person can you erase with a few clever hashtags and a well-timed sigh? I felt a cold, sharp violation as I realized the strangers in the comments were being recruited as witnesses for my eventual disappearance. They were the jury, and Elena was the prosecutor, and I was being convicted of incompetence in a court of public opinion before I even knew the trial had begun. I set the tablet back exactly where I had found it, making sure the screen was dark. I needed to move to breathe, but my thoughts were interrupted by a sharp, impatient knocking at the front door. It wasn't the polite tap of a neighbor or the rhythmic chime of a delivery driver. It was a demand. I moved to the foyer, my steps light and silent, and checked the security feed on the wall-mounted monitor. A man in his late 30s with a receding hairline and a clipboard gripped like a weapon stood on the porch, his eyes scanning the mansion with the cold efficiency of a liquidator. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit that smelled of stale cigarette smoke even through the digital interface. This was the appraiser Silas Thorne had mentioned in the alley. The vultures weren't just circling, they were landing. I realized then that the fading mind narrative Elena had so carefully constructed was now my primary defense. I couldn't be the man who defended his property. I had to be the structure that was too unstable to value. I opened the door, letting my jaw slacken and my eyes go dim, the vacant stare of the ruin I had practiced in the mirror. "I'm here for the walkthrough, Mr. Sterling. Your son said you were expecting me?" The man said, his voice a flat nasal rasp. He didn't look me in the eye. He looked at the crown molding and the marble floor, calculating the square footage of my life. "Walking? Oh, I don't walk much anymore." "Is it time for my oatmeal?" I asked, my voice thin and wavering. The appraiser looked at me like I was a condemned building, unaware that I was the one holding the demolition codes. He sighed a sound of profound annoyance and stepped past me into the house. He didn't ask for permission. He moved with the entitlement of a man who believed the person he was robbing was already dead. I led him into the great room, but instead of showing him the vaulted ceilings, I began to lead him in circles. I pointed at the floor and told him about the gophers that had invaded the root cellar in '92. "Sir, please just show me the basement access." He snapped his pen, hovering over a form labeled Asset Liquidation. "Basement. We don't have a basement, young man. We have a root cellar, but the gophers took it. Or was it the tax man? I can't remember which one has the sharper teeth," I rambled, watching his frustration mount. Every time he tried to take a measurement, I was in his way, asking him if he had seen my lost slippers, or if he knew where Annette had hidden the good silver. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt, the exact reaction I needed. He wanted the keys to the house. I gave him a tour of a graveyard. While he was distracted by a digital thermostat, he couldn't figure out I accidentally spilled a pitcher of ice water I had been carrying. The cold liquid soaked through his papers, turning his asset lists into a blurred, dripping mess. He let out a strangled curse, shaking the wet clipboard as if it were a wounded animal. I stood there rubbing my temples and looking like I was on the verge of tears, apologizing for my clumsiness. "I'm so sorry, the floors are so slippery today. Have you seen my keys? I think I put them in the trash." The appraiser had reached his limit. He looked at the waterlogged forms and the old man who couldn't remember what day it was, and he gave up. He turned on his heel, his heavy boots echoing on the hollow marble floors with a sound of angry finality. He didn't even say goodbye. As he reached his car, I watched him pull out his phone, his thumb stabbing at the screen with a desperate, jittery motion. Even from the porch, the air was still enough for me to catch the sharp, jagged edge of his voice as he barked into the receiver. "The old man is completely gone. The house is a mess of confusion." He didn't realize that my confusion was the only solid thing in the room. He drove away the gravel spraying from his tires, and I felt a surge of grim triumph. I had won the battle, but as I turned back to the foyer, I saw something that chilled my victory. A small high-tech GPS tracker had fallen from under his clipboard, its red light blinking with a persistent mechanical pulse on the white marble. Thorne wasn't just appraising the house. He was mapping the internal layout, tracing the very veins of the mansion for a forced entry. I watched him drive away, but the tracking light on the floor told me the house wasn't empty anymore. Thorne was already inside the wires. Midnight in the Sterling mansion doesn't sound like sleep. It sounds like the high-pitched hum of a server rack and the rhythmic predatory pacing of a son waiting for his father to disappear. I sat in the pitch-black silence of the guest bathroom, the only space in this sprawling mausoleum where I was certain the internal cameras couldn't see my face. My breath came in steady measured draws. I had watched the appraiser drive away earlier, leaving behind a blinking GPS tracker that proved Silas Thorne was already mapping the internal veins of the house. I wasn't just a guest anymore. I was an obstacle in a demolition zone. I reached out and turned the shower dial until a heavy roar of hot water filled the small room. The scent of chlorine and rising steam creating a layer of white noise to baffle the smart home microphones. In the fog, I pulled out my tablet, my fingers moving with a precision that would have shocked Julian. I initiated the encrypted call to Sonia Prescott, 68, and possessing a voice that could silence a courtroom, who looked at me through her reading glasses with the intensity of a hawk even through the digital grain of the screen. I met her years ago when I was a lead inspector, and she was the most feared land use attorney in the state. Sonia, they aren't just circling the house anymore, I whispered, leaning close to the tablet's mic. They're mapping the exits. An appraiser was here today. I found a tracker. Sonia didn't flinch, her expression remaining as ironclad as a bridge piling. Desmond, if you don't sign those papers, they'll find a way to make it look like you did, she warned. My sources tell me Julian has already contacted a notary, a cousin of Elena's, to illegally verify a forged signature tomorrow morning. He's bypassing you entirely. You need to find the physical evidence of that forgery before it reaches the county recorder. Check his office safe. The steam from the shower rose like a ghost in the mirror, a reminder that I was already dead to the people in the next room. I ended the call and sat for a moment as the water continued to beat against the tiles. The entry twist Sonia had delivered sat like a stone in my gut. They weren't waiting for my signatures or my permission. They were simply going to manufacture a reality where I no longer had a say in my own life. I turned off the water, wiped the screen of my tablet, and listened. From the master suite down the hall, I could hear the distant rhythmic snoring of Julian, a sound that used to represent safety and family, but now sounded like the heavy breathing of a predator at rest. I dressed in dark, soft cotton and reached into my luggage for the small black kit I had kept hidden in the lining. It contained a blue-white inspection flashlight and a set of professional lockpicks from my days on the municipal board. I crept into the hallway, avoiding the pressure-sensitive floorboards near the master suite, with the practiced stealth of a man who knows exactly how a structure groans under a load. The mansion felt different at night, the shadows longer and sharper, the air clinical and cold. When I reached Julian's home office, I found a new hurdle, a sleek biometric lock glowing with a faint mocking blue light. He had upgraded the security since I arrived. You forgot I was the one who taught you that. Shortcuts always lead to a collapse, Julian, I thought. He had focused on the door, but he had forgotten the bones of the house. When does a son stop being a legacy and start being a liability? I looked up at the ceiling, where the ventilation duct offered a structural flaw he had overlooked in his rush for high-tech veneers. I moved a designer chair, climbed with a silent effort that made my old muscles scream, and slid into the crawl space. I emerged inside the office, the room smelling of ozone and expensive leather. I ignored the laptop and went straight for the floor safe hidden beneath the mahogany desk. My hands were steady as I worked the tumblers, the cold, clinical click of the mechanism of familiar language. When the door swung open, I didn't find stacks of cash. I found a manila folder. Inside was a power of attorney document with my own name at the bottom. I stared at the signature. It was a masterpiece of mimicry, capturing the exact tremor of an old man's hand. Beside it lay a practice sheet where Julian had scribbled Desmond Sterling dozens of times, pressing so hard with the pen that the paper was embossed with his desperation. You even practiced the shakiness, I whispered, the blue-white beam of my light cutting through the gloom. You really wanted me to look frail on paper, didn't you? The investment talk at dinner had been a theater, a distraction to keep me looking at the wrong hand, while the real theft was being finalized in the dark. He didn't just want my house, he wanted my pulse to stop. Beneath the forgery, my light caught the edge of a second folder. I pulled it out, my fingers trembling for real this time. It was a life insurance policy Julian had taken out on me 6 months ago. I flipped to the final page and felt a void open up beneath my feet. There was a double indemnity clause for accidental death. A structural failure of the heart, perhaps, or a fall down the grand marble staircase that Julian was so proud of. The realization was a short, sharp shock that redefined the stakes. This wasn't just a financial liquidation, it was a biological one. I stared at the insurance policy and the forged signature, realizing that my son hadn't just built a cage for my mind, he'd been measuring me for a coffin. I photographed every page with my tablet, my movements cold and clinical now. I was no longer a father looking for a way to save his son. I was an inspector who had found a terminal fracture in the main support. The bridge was going to fall, and I had to make sure I wasn't on it when it went down. I slid the folders back, locked the safe, and retreated through the vent, leaving the office exactly as I had found it. As I climbed back into the guest bathroom, the first light of dawn was beginning to gray the edges of the world. I had exactly 12 hours before the notary arrived, and I knew the only person who could help me now was the one man who still knew how to hunt the sharks that swam in these deep, dark waters. The morning mist in Riverwalk Park tasted like cold iron, a fitting flavor for a man who had just realized his own flesh and blood was betting on his heartbeat to stop. I had left the Sterling mansion before the sun could touch the glass, moving like a shadow through the silent rooms. The discovery of that life insurance policy felt like a terminal diagnosis for my son's morality. I walked toward the far side of the park, my steps firm and intentional. I wasn't just an aging father anymore. I was a man who had identified the fatal flaw in Julian's plan and decided to trigger a controlled demolition of his lies before the roof could collapse on my head. I arrived at the Rusty Bean while the street was still waking up. Caleb Henderson was already there, flipping the metallic clang of the closed sign to open as I approached. He looked at me, and whatever he saw on my face made him pull me inside and lock the door behind us. We sat at the back corner table, away from the windows. I didn't say a word as I pulled out my phone and swiped through the photos I had taken in Julian's office safe, the forged thus power of attorney. The practice sheets with my trembling signature mimicked dozens of times, and finally, the insurance policy. Caleb's breath hitched a ragged sound in the quiet shop. I thought it was just the house, Caleb, I whispered, my voice sounding older than I felt. But he's measuring the depth of the grave. Caleb's hands trembled with a visible white-knuckled rage as he leaned over the screen. Thorne doesn't leave loose ends. Desmond, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He leaves settlements. I've been recording his visits here for weeks, keeping a log of the people he meets in the back. He has a history of liquidating families right after policies like this are enacted. It's his signature move, his way of ensuring the debt is collected one way or another. Information is like water. It always finds the cracks in the basement eventually. I realized that my son hadn't just made a mistake. He had entered into a contract with a man who viewed human life as an amortized asset. Caleb looked at me, his eyes full of a grim sympathy. "We can't stay here, Des. My mother needs to see you. She's been asking, and after seeing this, she's the only one left who knows the whole story of what your Annette was doing when Thorne first came to town." We left the shop and drove in silence to the Sunnyvale nursing home. The air inside was a thick mixture of floor wax and lavender, a scent that usually signaled the end of things, but today it felt like a library of secrets waiting to be read. Mrs. Henderson, a 90-year-old with white hair as fine as silk and eyes that had seen through the pretenses of 3 generations, sat in her wheelchair with the dignity of a queen in exile. She was positioned in a sun-drenched corner of the garden, watching the dust motes dance in the light. When she saw me, her eyes sharpened with a sudden piercing clarity. "Desmond Sterling," she said, her voice like dry parchment, "you look like you've finally seen the ghost that's been following you." She took my hand, her skin feeling papery and translucent, yet her grip was surprisingly firm. She told me about a time 30 years ago, when Silas Thorne first tried to bulldoze the local community land trust to build a mall. I listened stunned as she revealed that Annette had been the one to organize the legal firewall that stopped him. My wife had built a hidden infrastructure of protection for the neighborhood. A secret she never told me, because she wanted to keep the storm away from my door while I was busy inspecting the city's bridges. How many secrets can one marriage hold before the weight of them pulls the house down? I felt a surge of awe for the woman I had shared a bed with for 40 years, realizing she had been a warrior in the shadows long before I ever had to be. My son didn't just stumble into this. He's been a predator in training for a long time. Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed as she looked at me. "Julian came to see me a month ago, Desmond. He was charming at first, asking about the old days, about Annette's papers. He was trying to trick me into telling him where she kept her secret files. He's been hunting that trust for longer than you know. He knows the house on Elm Street is the only thing standing between him and Thorne's debt, and he's willing to burn down his mother's heart just to settle his tab. She leaned in closer, her face inches from mine. That orchard Annette planted wasn't just land, Desmond, it was a promise. Don't let that boy turn it into a high-rise. You fight like a Sterling. Use that wisdom you've gathered over 70 years. You take the match right out of his hand before he can strike it. I sat there in the morning sun, the bitter earthy taste of the dregs of the coffee Caleb had brought earlier lingering on my tongue. The inspiration I felt was tempered by a cold, hard resolution. I wasn't just defending a piece of property, I was defending the soul of my wife's legacy and my own right to keep breathing. Mrs. Henderson watched me, a small, knowing smile on her lips, as she saw the iron return to my spine. I realized then that the war for Elm Street hadn't started a week ago. It had started in the silence of my own home, years before Annette took her last breath. I stood up and kissed the old woman's hand. I won't let him do it, I promised. I'll be the one to show him what happens when a structure is built on a lie. As Caleb led me back to the car, the world felt sharper, the colors of the garden more vivid. I was ready to return to the mansion, ready to put on the mask of the broken man one more time. But this time, I knew exactly where the weak points were in Julian's world. The foundation of his life was rotting, and I was the only inspector left to call for the demolition. I barely had time to wipe the Riverwalk mist from my coat before Julian's SUV was idling in the driveway, its engine purring with a predatory hunger that matched the look in my son's eyes. I had made a detour through the back garden to reach the side entrance, hoping to avoid a direct confrontation until I could settle my nerves. The revelation from Mrs. Henderson that Julian had been hunting Annette's secret trust files long before I even suspected a betrayal felt like a cold draft in a room I thought was sealed. I was still absorbing the fact that my wife had been a silent warrior against Silas Thorne, a man who now held my son by the throat. Before I could even reach for the door handle, the electronic lock chirped, and Julian stepped out, his face a masterpiece of forced, glossy sentimentality. He was already dressed in one of his sharp three-piece suits, looking like a man ready to close a deal rather than spend a morning with his father. "Desmond, there you are. I was getting worried," he said, his voice pitching high with an artificial cheer that set my teeth on edge. "I was thinking, Dad, maybe a trip to the old place would do you some good. Clear the cobwebs, you know. Collect some memories before we finalize the transition to the new estate." I leaned heavily on my cane, letting my shoulders slump just enough to satisfy his expectations. I had already taken the precaution of disabling the electronic tracking on my phone before I ever reached the nursing home earlier that morning. If Julian had checked his smart home dashboard, all he would see was a dead signal at a local diner. He thought I was wandering in the fog, but I was the one keeping him in the dark. "The cobwebs are the only things that haven't changed, Julian," I replied, keeping my tone weary and hollow. He nodded, ushering me toward the passenger seat, with a practiced efficiency that felt more like a shepherd moving a sheep toward a pen than a son helping his father. Being in the car with Julian was like sitting inside a high-speed centrifuge. Everything real was being spun out to the edges. The SUV smelled of high-grade leather upholstery and an expensive clinical scent that Julian called success. As we moved through the suburbs toward the city, he kept up a running commentary on the landscape, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the steering wheel. "Look at that corner, Dad. Used to be a hardware store. Now it's a tech hub. That's progress," he noted, gesturing toward a glass and steel monstrosity that had replaced a brick building I remembered from my youth. "Progress usually means someone lost their seat at the table," I countered, staring out the window. "How many memories do you have to kill before you can live comfortably in a lie?" I wondered as I watched the familiar sights of my life being paved over. Julian didn't answer. He just increased the speed, his eyes fixed on the road ahead with a singular, desperate focus. He wasn't just driving us to the old house. He was trying to outrun the ghost of Silas Thorne. We pulled onto Elm Street, the gravel crunching under the heavy tires, with a sound that felt like bone breaking. The old house stood there, framed by the orchard Annette had planted, looking dignified, despite the neglect of the last few months. The air inside was still and smelled of lemon polish and a heavy, suffocating sense of history. It was a structure built on truth, and being inside it seemed to make Julian's polished veneer crack. He didn't waste time with nostalgia. He led me straight to the pantry, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. "Dad, I need to verify some insurance titles for the estate merger. You remember the code to the small floor safe in here, right?" he asked, his voice betraying a jagged impatience. He knelt on the dusty floorboards, his expensive suit trousers wrinkling, as he looked at me with a look of predatory anticipation. I stood there letting my gaze wander aimlessly around the shelves of empty mason jars. I can see the numbers, Julian. I whispered, my voice trembling with a feigned frustration that I let build until I was on the verge of tears. But they won't sit still. It's like a puzzle with missing pieces. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I rubbed my temples looking at the safe as if it were a foreign artifact. Julian's mask slipped, then his jaw tightening and his pupils dilating with a raw, ugly anger. Dad, the code. Just think. It's usually a birthday or an anniversary. We don't have time for this. He snapped the corporate charm, vanishing to reveal the cornered animal underneath. He wanted the safe code. I wanted my son back. Neither of us was getting what we wanted. I continued the performance, whimpering about the fog in my mind, until he stood up with a frustrated grunt, his hands balled into fists at his sides. He stomped out of the kitchen, his boots thudding against the wood as he headed toward the garage, likely looking for a crowbar or a way to vent his rage. I stayed behind my spine, straightening the moment he was out of sight. I moved to the garage door, peering through the small window. Julian was throwing aside some old tarps in a corner, his movements frantic. My breath caught as I saw what he was trying to hide. Tucked under a heavy canvas cover was a large professional sold sign, its bright aggressive lettering shouting a reality I hadn't been prepared for. He hadn't just planned the sale. He had already closed a secret contingent deal. The house was already gone in his mind. He was just waiting for the papers in that safe to finalize the theft. I retreated back into the kitchen as I heard him returning, his footsteps heavy and uneven. He thought he was hunting for paper in a safe that had been empty for years, unaware that the real weapon was hidden right under our feet, in a place Julian would never think to look because he had never understood the true weight of a foundation. I looked at the floorboards in the master bedroom through the open doorway, knowing exactly where the tin box was hidden under the marriage bed. The real battle was about to begin. I stood in the silence of the bedroom where Julian was conceived, and Annette took her last breath, listening for the heavy, impatient footsteps of my son below before I dropped to my knees for the final inspection of our lives. The air in this room was thick with the scent of cedar and the slow, inevitable creep of dry rot, a reminder that even the strongest structures eventually yield to time. Julian was still in the kitchen, likely cursing the empty floor safe that had been nothing but a diversion for the last 10 years. I moved toward the bed, my old joints groaning in sympathy with the floorboards. Our marriage bed was a heavy oak beast, a piece of furniture meant to last generations. I reached under the frame, my fingers searching for the specific floorboard Annette had pointed out during those final lucid weeks when she was setting the legal firewall for our family's future. My calloused fingertips caught on a slight protrusion. With a grunt of effort, I pried the board loose. There, it was a battered tin box. The metallic rasp as I slid it across the floor sounded like a scream in the quiet room. I wiped away a fine layer of dust and time, my heart hammering against my ribs. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of her grandmother's old yellowed recipe cards, lay a manila folder labeled Heritage Trust. The parchment felt thick and ancient against my skin, but the ink was bold. The words, Irrevocable and Community Land Trust, shone like gold in the dim light of the bedroom. I had spent 40 years certifying the safety of the city's infrastructure, but this was the only document that truly mattered now. It was the failsafe Annette had designed to ensure that 14 Elm Street would never become a chip on a gambler's table. I flipped through the pages and my breath hitched. The trust documents felt like a structural reinforcement, a steel beam I was carrying inside my chest to keep my heart from collapsing. Beneath the legal jargon, Annette had left a second gift, a meticulously detailed ledger. It was a list of every bribe Julian had ever taken from Silas Thorne, every back alley agreement and kickback he had accepted while my wife was still alive. She had been watching him fall for years, logging the rot in our son's character with the same precision I use for rusted bolts. My son wasn't just in debt. He was a career criminal in the making. The weight of the folder became almost unbearable, a physical manifestation of a mother's broken heart and a wife's final protective instinct. Yet you were always the architect of our safety. Annette, I whispered, my eyes stinging with a sudden sharp grief that tasted like copper. I heard the heavy thud of Julian's boots on the stairs. He was coming, his frustration radiating through the house like a thermal leak. I didn't have time to put the box back properly. I shoved the Heritage Trust folder under my shirt, the cold crinkle of the parchment against my skin, feeling like a secret armor I left the tin box open on the bed, scattering the recipe cards and a few old tax returns on top as a decoy. I moved with a speed that defied my 70 years, slipping out the back door of the bedroom and onto the balcony just as Julian burst through the hall door. I didn't look back. I climbed down the external stairs structures I had reinforced myself 5 years ago and disappeared into the heritage orchard. Julian looked at the trees and saw lumber. I looked at the trees and saw my wife's soul. The orchard was heavy with the scent of overripe apples, a cloying, sticky sweetness that felt like a funeral shroud. I found the hollow in the oldest apple tree, the one Julian and I had planted together when he was only 5 years old. It was a gnarled, stubborn thing that refused to die. I stashed the tin box deep in the cavity, covering it with moss and loose bark. I knew Julian's arrogance would never let him look at something he considered worthless. To him, this orchard was just a hurdle for a bulldozer. To me, it was a vault. I straightened my shirt, feeling the sharp corners of the trust folder pressing against my ribs, and walked toward the center of the grove. "Just taking in the air, Julian. The trees are looking thirsty," I said when he finally found me, my voice wavering with a carefully practiced tremor. He was fuming, his expensive silk tie loosened, and his face a mask of jagged, ugly impatience. "We don't have time for the trees, Dad." He snapped the corporate veneer, finally stripped away to reveal the predator underneath. "If we can't find that safe code, this whole trip was a waste of my afternoon. Let's go. I've got meetings." I let my lip tremble, staring at him, with the vacant hurt eyes of a man who no longer recognized his own blood. "I'm just a tired old man, Julian. I've got nothing left for you." I started to weep softly, a performance that felt increasingly like the truth. How do you tell your son that his inheritance isn't a house, but a hard-learned lesson in integrity? Julian let out a sound of pure disgust. "Clearly. Let's get out of here. This place smells like failure." He grabbed my arm, his grip hard and dismissive, and marched me toward the SUV. The engine was already idling impatiently, the vibration felt through the gravel. I sat in the passenger seat, the leather feeling cold and clinical, and allowed myself to be ushered away from the only home I ever loved. Julian didn't speak a word as he reversed out of the driveway, his jaw locked in a silent fury. He thought he was leaving empty-handed, unaware that the documents that would eventually destroy his hollow world were currently pressed against his father's heart. As we pulled away from the curb, I looked in the rearview mirror. A black sedan with tinted windows was parked half a block down, its engine off, but its presence unmistakable. As soon as Julian turned the corner, the sedan pulled out, keeping a disciplined distance behind us. I realized then that Silas Thorne wasn't just Julian's shadow anymore. He was becoming mine. The trust documents under my shirt felt like a ticking clock, a countdown to a confrontation that I could no longer avoid. Thorne was watching. Julian was drowning, and I was the only man left standing on the bridge. The cool evening air of the mansion garden should have been a relief. But the paper against my ribs felt like a live wire, a charge from the past that was about to blow Julian's high-rise dreams to pieces. I had arrived back at the Sterling estate with the stifling silence inside the SUV still ringing in my ears. The weight of the Heritage Trust documents beneath my shirt, making every breath feel like a tactical maneuver. Julian had barely acknowledged me as we pulled into the driveway, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. He was drowning in his own desperation, oblivious to the fact that I was carrying the very anchor that would either save our family's honor or drag his house of cards into the abyss. I moved with a practiced, weary shuffle toward the side gate, feigning a need for fresh air to settle my nerves. Once I was deep enough in the manicured greenery, I veered away from the paved paths, heading for the far corner of the garden, where a thicket of overgrown hedges offered a sanctuary from the prying electronic eyes of the mansion's smart cameras. I pulled out my phone, my fingers steady despite the chill. I needed validation. I needed to know that the steel I was carrying was real. I dialed the encrypted line for Sonia Prescott, and she picked up on the second ring. "Sonia, tell me this is real," I whispered, my voice barely a thread in the wind. "Tell me Annette did what I think she did." I began to read the specific clauses from the documents I had retrieved from under our marriage bed, my heart hammering a rhythm that only an inspector knows the sound of a structure finally making sense. Sonia's voice sharpened into a blade on the other end of the line. "It's ironclad, Desmond," she confirmed. "The trust was registered nearly a decade ago. It effectively makes Julian a trespasser on his own inheritance. The house at 14 Elm Street is no longer his to sell. It hasn't been for 8 years. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent I had to lean against a stone birdbath for support. The trust wasn't just a document, it was a bridge Annette built over a river of greed she knew was coming. My wife had seen the cracks in our sun before I ever dared to look at them. While still on the phone with Sonia, I caught a movement through the glass terrace doors of the great room. Elena was there, bathed in the harsh artificial glow of her professional ring lights. She was staging a charity donation photo shoot, surrounded by empty designer boxes and a handful of hired volunteers. She was directing with the cold, rhythmic efficiency of a drill sergeant. "Hold the box higher. I need the light to hit the logo," I heard her muffled command. "Authentic empathy, people. Let's go." I watched the performance with a mounting sense of contempt. "She was building a cathedral out of cardboard, Sonia," I murmured into the phone. The contrast was staggering. Elena was selling a lie of generosity to thousands of strangers, while I held the truth of a real community legacy in my hands. How many likes is a family's dignity worth in the currency of Elena's digital world? I realized then that they weren't just taking my house. They were trying to replace the honest stone and timber of our lives with a hollow plastic veneer that would never hold a load. Sonia's tone shifted, becoming clinical and urgent. "Desmond, there's something else. My sources indicate Julian has likely already promised that title to Silas Thorne as collateral for his gambling debts. If he signs a deed now, even a fraudulent one, the land trust will sue, but the property could be tied up in litigation for years. Thorne will bleed the estate dry while the lawyers argue." I felt the poison pill clause I had just read under the bed frame burn in my mind. If any heir attempts to commit the other parent to an institution, their entire remaining inheritance is immediately forfeited to the state. Annette had seen everything. "I don't want a court case, Sonia," I said, my voice hardening into the firm resolve of an inspector calling for an emergency demolition. "I want a reckoning." "Then you have to sign Desmond," she replied. "You have to lead them into the right room. You have to sign the wrong paper in the right place to trigger the federal trap." I understood. I wasn't going to block the sale. I was going to let Julian and Thorne walk right onto the bridge before I pulled the pins. The card tower was wobbling. I just needed to breathe on it. I looked back toward the terrace glass, the rhythmic click flash of Elena's camera reflecting off the panes like a low-frequency warning. I adjusted the folder against my skin, the sharp edges of the manila parchment a constant reminder of the stakes. I was about to walk into a den of vipers, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the bite. I had the blueprints for their destruction. I was about to hang up when I caught a flicker of movement in the reflection of the terrace glass. My breath hitched. Above the terrace on the master balcony, a figure was standing in the shadows. It was Julian. He was looking down into the garden, his silhouette framed by the cold overhead glare of the security lights. He wasn't moving. He was staring directly toward the thicket where I was hiding. The suspicion on his face was a physical weight, intense and frozen. I looked up and met Julian's gaze. His shadow stretched across the lawn like a stain, and for the first time he wasn't looking at a senile old man. He was looking at an enemy. The static, heavy hum of the phone line was the only sound in the sudden, terrifying silence of the garden. He knew I was hiding something. The inspection was over, and the collapse was beginning. Julian's stare from the balcony didn't just feel cold. It felt like a structural stress test, a silent demand to know exactly how much of the bridge I was still holding up. I quickly tucked the tablet away, the metal edges biting into my hip, and forced my spine to curve into the familiar, defeated arch of a man whose mind was supposed to be drifting. I shuffled back into the house, deliberately letting my feet drag across the stone tiles as I passed beneath him. My heart was a hammer in my chest, yet I kept my face as blank as a fresh pour of concrete. As I crossed the threshold into the hallway, Julian was already there, having descended the stairs, with a predatory speed that set my teeth on edge. "Who are you talking to out there?" "Dad!" I saw the glow of a screen, he said, his voice dripping with a new, sharper edge of suspicion that I hadn't heard before. I stopped blinking slowly, letting my eyes glaze over, as if searching for a thought that had already dissolved. "Just looking for the evening stars, Julian. Has Mr. Henderson brought over the mail?" Yet I asked, my voice thin and wavering. Julian's jaw tightened, his eyes scanning me for any sign of a fracture in my performance. "Mr. Henderson has been dead for 5 years, Dad. Go to bed." I let out a long, weary sigh and nodded, playing the part of the confused father until I was safely behind my bedroom door. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, waiting for the house to go silent. I realized then that Julian didn't just see me in the garden. He had installed a high-frequency motion sensor that I had tripped, revealing that my supposed blind spots were no longer safe. The mask was getting heavy, but Julian's conscience was non-existent. I had to move deeper into the structure of his lies if I wanted to survive. Late that night, long after the rhythmic silence of the mansion had settled, I pulled out the tablet. I used my technical knowledge to access an old encrypted cloud backup Julian had long forgotten one synced from his college laptop years ago. He was sloppy back then, leaving breadcrumbs of his greed that he thought time had buried. I bypassed the security using the date of Annette's first surgery as the key. It was the only date that had ever truly broken us, and I knew Julian would use it not out of love, but because it was a moment of profound weakness he could never forget. The screen flickered to life, revealing a hidden folder titled Emergency Reserves. Data is the one thing in this world that never forgets a sin, and Julian had left a digital bloodbath. I began to scroll through banking records from 8 years ago during the height of Annette's cancer battle. My eyes burned from the blue light, but I couldn't stop. I found the ledger for the Annette Sterling Medical Trust, the fund we had built to ensure she had access to the best specialists in the country. I remember the day the hospital told us the fund was empty, forcing me to take out the second mortgage that Julian was now trying to leverage into a high-rise. I had always blamed the rising cost of healthcare, but the digital ledger told a much darker story. Julian had been siphoning thousands of dollars from that fund to cover his first failed venture capital bets. He had literally stolen the money intended for his mother's life-saving treatments, watching her fade while he tried to play the market with her survival. The cold rage I felt before turned into a singular lethal resolve. He hadn't just failed us. He had preyed on her while she was at her most vulnerable. Let me tell you something about structural failure. It always starts at the point of greatest greed. What would you do if you realized the person you loved most had been murdered by inches by the person you gave life to? I stared at the red withdrawal columns, each one representing a day of pain Annette had to endure because the money for her comfort was being gambled away in a Chicago high-rise. Julian had drafted a statement of incompetence for the hospital 8 years ago, attempting to seize total control even then, but Annette had blocked it. She knew. She had seen the rot in him before he ever mastered the art of the expensive suit. She didn't tell me to protect me, but now the truth was laid bare in the clinical glow of the screen. I wasn't just an inspector anymore. I was a witness to a crime that transcended money. The motive for the murder Julian hadn't committed yet was right there in my hands, written in the cold language of debits and credits. I closed the tablet, the blue light of the screen burning in my retinas like a brand. My fingernails dug into my palms, the pain a grounding wire for the fury that threatened to consume me. I didn't just have the trust documents anymore. I had the proof of a betrayal so deep it could never be repaired. The air in the guest room felt old and stale, heavy with the scent of a grief I had never truly processed. I had been living in a house built by a man who had sold his mother's life for a seat at a table that didn't want him. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the first light of dawn gray the edges of the manicured lawn. The aggression of the world was coming for me, and I was ready for it. I heard the low, distant rumble of a high-performance engine in the driveway, the sound of Silas Thorne arriving for his final violent update. The sudden silence that followed was sharper than any scream. I straightened my shirt and prepared to walk back into the lion's den, knowing that the foundation of Julian's world was about to be obliterated by the very weight of his own sins. I didn't need to look through the curtains to know Silas Thorne had arrived. The heavy rhythmic thrum of his idling car felt like a predator's heartbeat vibrating through the very soles of my feet. The morning mist was still clinging to the lawn, but the heat of that engine promised a day of friction. I stood in the foyer, my spine curved, my jaw slack, and my eyes fixed on a point an inch past reality. Julian rushed past me to open the door, his movements jerky and frantic. Silas Thorne didn't walk. He glided through the room like a crack in a windshield, promising a total shatter if you hit one more bump. He was dressed in a suit the color of charcoal, and his presence immediately made the high-ceilinged lounge feel claustrophobic, as if he were sucking the oxygen out of the room to fuel his own cold fire. He didn't look at the art on the walls or the expensive rugs. He looked at Julian with the clinical hunger of a man who was already calculating the resale value of his skin. "Julian, I don't trade in almost, and soon," Thorne said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I trade in titles. Where is the deed?" Julian stammered, gesturing vaguely toward the kitchen. "It's almost ready, Silas. My father just needs a moment to clear his head." I chose that moment to shuffle into the lounge, playing my confused role to perfection. I carried a glass of water, my hand trembling just enough to be noticeable. "Oh, hello," I murmured, looking at Thorne with a vacant squint. "Are you here about the furnace? It's been making such a racket. It's hard to sleep with all that banging." Julian's face turned a mottled purple. Dad, not now. This is Mr. Thorne. I stepped closer, peering at Thorne's expensive leather briefcase as if it were a strange animal. As I passed the side table, I let my elbow catch the edge of the glass. The water cascaded across the polished wood, splashing dangerously close to Thorne's shoes and his case. Julian let out a strangled yelp, rushing to the kitchen to find a cloth. Silas Thorne didn't move, but the predatory light in his eyes sharpened as he looked down at the mess. While Julian was out of the room, I leaned in toward Thorne. The vacant stare vanished for a heartbeat, replaced by a lucidity so sharp it was like a blade emerging from a sheath. I hope Julian's new friends in the Cayman Islands are as nice as you, Mr. Thorne, I whispered, my voice steady and cold. He looked like he was having such a grand time on that encrypted call yesterday, talking about secret offshore accounts and fresh starts. I'd hate to think he was leaving a man like you behind without a proper goodbye. Thorne froze. The stillness of the man became something else, a coiled tension. Cayman Islands. What are you talking about, old man? He demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I heard him, I said, leaning back as Julian returned with a bundle of paper towels. Something about the transfer being complete by Friday night. Such a busy boy. Have you ever watched two vipers try to swallow each other? It's a messy business, and I was holding the salt. Thorne watched Julian clean the floor, his expression unreadable, but his gaze now dripping with a lethal suspicion. Thorne stood up abruptly, his briefcase gripped tight. He didn't say another word to Julian, ignoring my son's desperate pleas for more time. He walked out of the mansion, the heavy front door thudding shut behind him, like a cell door. Julian stood there, holding a damp paper towel, looking like a man who had just seen his executioner walk away to sharpen the axe. Before I uncover the next layer of this betrayal and show you the evidence I found hidden in that drawer, I need to know who is still standing here with me in the trenches. If you are still listening, if you are still riding with me, please drop a 75 in the comments right now to show your support for a father's fight for dignity. And a quick word of caution as we move forward. Some details of this journey involve dramatized elements and fictionalized sequences that may stretch the bounds of belief if you're only looking for a dry, factual report. This might be the moment to step away. But if you're ready for the truth behind the curtain, stay tuned. I waited until Julian retreated to his office to vent his terror on a bottle of scotch before I moved toward the guest bathroom. I locked the door and turned on the exhaust fan. The high-pitched hum provided a thin veil of privacy. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number Sonia had given me for the county recorder's office. The clock wasn't ticking anymore. It was screaming. "My name is Desmond Sterling," I said, my voice no longer trembling. "I'm calling to report a fraudulent signature on a pending property transfer at 14 Elm Street. I believe there is a case of elder financial abuse in progress." I could hear the rhythmic tapping of a keyboard on the other end. The clerk confirmed that a transfer was indeed pending, likely triggered by the forged power of attorney Julian had scanned earlier. "We've flagged the file, Mr. Sterling," she told me. "Under the new statutes, no changes can be made for 48 hours while we investigate the claim." I closed my eyes, a wave of tactical relief washing over me. I had just cut the bridge out from under them. I realized during that call that Silas Thorne actually knows about the trust, but he believes it's a revocable trust that Julian can easily break, not realizing Annette made it irrevocable. He thinks he's stealing a house, but he's really just buying a lawsuit. As I hung up the phone, a cold chill ran down my spine. I heard a muffled sound from the other side of the bathroom door. I pressed my ear to the wood, holding my breath. It was Elena. She was whispering into her phone, her voice frantic and venomous. "The notary is here," she said. "I don't care if Julian is falling apart. We're doing it now, whether the old man is awake or not. Just get the papers in the room." I gripped the sink until my knuckles turned white, listening to the scratch of a pen on the other side of the door that sounded like a shovel hitting the dirt of my own grave. They weren't waiting for the morning. They were coming for the foundation tonight. The lock on the bathroom door rattled not with the force of a break-in, but with the steady rhythmic insistence of a vulture waiting for a heartbeat to stop. I stayed perfectly still, my hand still hovering over the faucet I had turned off seconds ago. The sharp click of the bathroom door lock being tested from the outside was followed by Elena's sweet, venomous voice calling my name. "Desmond, are you all right in there? We have some guests who would love to see you." She cooed her tone, carrying that artificial warmth she saved for her followers. I took a breath, letting my shoulders slump, and my expression go vacant before I turned the handle. She was waiting in the shadows of the hallway, her smartphone clutched in one hand like a talisman. I noticed she had already begun packing her real jewelry into a hidden leather suitcase tucked behind the linen closet door. She was planning to flee the country the moment the house sale cleared, leaving Julian to face Thorne's wrath alone. She pulled me into the narrow space of the linen closet hallway, her scent of overly strong, expensive perfume cloying in the cramped quarters. "Julian is a sinking ship, Desmond. You and I, we can be the lifeboats," she whispered, dropping the mask entirely. She offered to hide me or lose the forged documents in exchange for a direct cash payout from the trust. "You'd sell your own husband for a designer luggage set, wouldn't you, Elena?" I asked, keeping my voice low. She didn't deny it. She just smiled a look that proved she was ready to devour her own family to stay afloat. I brushed past her, stumbling slightly for effect, and made my way toward the mezzanine. The mansion felt like a jar full of scorpions, and the lid was finally beginning to screw tight. Below me in the home office, Silas Thorne had returned unexpectedly. He had bypassed the security system with a code Julian had clearly provided in a fit of terror. I watched from the shadows as Thorne cornered my son, his presence radiating a physical threat that made the expansive room feel like a cage. Silas didn't bother with corporate pleasantries this time. He swept Julian's expensive hollow awards off the desk with a single violent motion. The sound of glass shattering on the marble floor echoed up to me, a sharp punctuation to Julian's whimpering. "I don't just want the house anymore, Julian. I want the interest on my wasted time." Thorne growled his hand, landing on Julian's shoulder with a weight that made my son buckle. "Please, Silas, I have the papers. I just need him to hold the pen," Julian pleaded, his upper lip slick with sweat. Thorne leaned in, his voice a low rasp that carried a terrifying promise. "Accidents happen to families who forget their debts, Julian. I remember a fire on Wacker Drive last year. Such a tragedy. Don't let your father be the next headline." Is there anything more pathetic than a predator begging a shark for mercy? I realized then that the structural integrity of my son's life wasn't just compromised. It was non-existent. I chose that moment to stumble into the office, feigning a sudden burst of lucidity and terror. I began to weep, my hands trembling as I pointed at the broken glass. "I'll sign it. I'll sign whatever you want. Just stop the shouting," I cried, playing the part of the broken old man to perfection. Julian rushed to me, his hands shaking as he tried to steady me, but his eyes were fixed on Thorne, begging for approval. "Tomorrow morning, Wacker Drive. 9 a.m. sharp," Thorne said, adjusting his cuffs. "Don't be late for your own funeral, Julian." He turned to leave, but as he brushed past me to reach the door, I feigned a sudden stumble, leaning heavily against his side. In that split second of feigned clumsiness, my fingers deftly ghosted into his blazer pocket, snagging a small piece of cardstock before he could even register the contact. It was a silent triumph. It was a false defeat for me, but a secret triumph. I had led the wolves exactly where I wanted them. As I reached down to help Julian pick up the debris, I palmed the card. It was a business card, but the logo made my blood run cold. Silas Thorne was a former liquidator for the very municipal board I had worked for decades ago. This wasn't just a random predatory loan. This was a decades-old grudge hidden beneath a suit. I watched the taillights of Thorne's car vanish down the long, winding driveway, then turned to see Julian smiling at me. It was a sickening, relieved smile, the look of a man who thought he had finally won, unaware that the foundation of his world was already missing. He thought he had manipulated me into submission, never realizing that I was the one who had mapped the collapse. The mansion was silent now, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. But for me, that sound was a countdown. I retreated to my guest room, the weight of the business card in my pocket feeling like a live wire. I wasn't just signing a deed tomorrow. I was signing Julian's eviction notice from my heart. I sat on the edge of the bed, the darkness of the room pressing in, and pulled out the digital recorder I'd been hiding. I checked the levels, ensuring every threat Silas had uttered was captured in high fidelity. The card in my hand told me Thorne knew exactly who I was, which meant the trap had to be even more precise. I looked at the single flickering candle I'd lit, the flame dancing in the draft from the hallway. Everything was in place. The documents, the evidence, and the players. Tomorrow we would go to the glass tower, and I would show them what happens when you try to pull down a structure built on 70 years of truth. I lay back, closing my eyes, but sleep was a distant country. I just listened to the house groan, waiting for the sun to rise on the final day of the Sterling legacy. Julian's smile was the most expensive thing in the room, but as I looked at him, I realized he was smiling at a man who didn't exist anymore, the victim he'd spent weeks carefully constructing. He didn't know that the foundation of his victory was built on quicksand. I had spent the last hour in the flickering light of a single candle in the guest room, double-checking the digital recorder hidden in my jacket pocket, ensuring the silent witness to his crimes was ready. I needed to move before the sun rose, before Julian's household sensors could track my departure. I slipped out of the mansion at midnight, the cool suburban air a sharp contrast to the suffocating luxury of the house I was leaving behind. I drove to a local 24-hour diner on the edge of Naperville, a place where the smell of stale grease and industrial coffee acted as a grounding wire for my nerves. Sonia Prescott was already there, sitting in a back booth, her expression as ironclad as a bridge piling. We sat in silence for a moment as she reviewed the digital evidence I had harvested: the medical fund theft, the recorded threats from Silas Thorne, and the forged power of attorney. "This isn't just about a house anymore, Desmond. This is about making sure they can never do this again," she said, her voice low and clinical. "I want the records clean, Sonia. I want the truth written in a way even Julian can't edit," I replied. She handed me a discreet digital recorder and a set of legal triggers to use during the meeting. These would ensure his actions met the federal threshold for bank fraud. I looked at the bus ticket I had prepared earlier. It wasn't for Julian to escape. It was the exact route Julian used to take to the hospital when Annette was dying. I intended to place it on the table during the signing, a psychological trigger to let him know I knew everything. I returned to the mansion and sat in the dark of my guest room, winding my father's vintage Bridge Inspector watch one last time. The rhythmic click wind was the only sound in the oppressive silence. I reflected on the structural integrity of my own family, realizing that some cracks are too deep to patch. I secured the Heritage Trust documents into a hidden compartment in my old municipal jacket, preparing for the morning's execution. At dawn, Julian and Elena ushered me into the SUV. The atmosphere was thick with a performative, frantic excitement. Julian was sweating through his shirt, driving too fast toward Wacker Drive, while Elena sat in the back, her fingers flying across her phone as she deleted unprofitable photos from her cloud storage to make room for their new lifestyle. "Are we going to the museum? Julian, I think I forgot my tickets," I murmured, trailing my hand across the leather seat. "Better than a museum, Dad. We're going to the future," he replied, his voice pitching high with a desperate sort of joy. "Have you ever sat in a car and realized you were the only one who knew the bridge ahead was out?" As we pulled into the parking garage beneath Thorne's skyscraper, I noticed a folder on the dashboard labeled Exit Strategy. I caught a glimpse of the contents. Julian was planning to leave Elena at the airport immediately after the signing. He was betraying his partner in crime even as they prepared to gut me. The elevator ride to the 50th floor was a silent, pressurized climb. I let my jaw slacken and my eyes go dim, the perfect image of a mind lost in the fog. Julian stood beside me, his reflection in the polished steel doors, showing a man on the verge of a total collapse, though he thought he was at the height of his power. The elevator doors opened with a chime that sounded like a bell at the start of a heavyweight fight. The clinical artificial scent of the office lobby's air filtration system filled my lungs, a scent that smelled of cold calculations and high-altitude greed. I was no longer a father looking for a way to save his son. I was an inspector who had found a terminal fracture in the main support. Julian gripped my arm, his fingers digging into my sleeve as he led me toward the thick, sound-dampening carpet of the executive suite. I saw Silas Thorne standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, silhouetted by the morning sun, looking like a man who owned the very air we were about to breathe. The trap was set and the vultures were ready to feed, unaware that the meal was about to bite back. Stepping onto the plush charcoal carpet of the executive suite, I felt the air pressure change, not just from the altitude, but from the crushing weight of the lies Julian was carrying in the folder under his arm. Julian and Elena guided me toward a high-backed leather chair, with the exaggerated care one might show a delicate porcelain vase. I played my part, letting my gaze drift aimlessly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, where the Chicago skyline stretched out in a hazy industrial panoramic. Silas Thorne stood by the glass, silhouetted against the morning sun. His slate-gray suit blended so perfectly into the urban gloom that he looked less like a man and more like a permanent fixture of the city's cold architecture. "Beautiful view, mister." "Sterling." Thorne finally said, his voice a low rasp that didn't carry a hint of warmth. "A perfect place to secure your future." "I think I saw a bird," I murmured, my voice thin and wavering. Was that a hawk, Julian?" My son forced a laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering over pavement, a frantic sound that did nothing to hide the sweat blooming on his temples. Thorne's office was a cathedral built to worship the dollar, and I was about to overturn the altars. Julian leaned in his fingers, digging slightly into my shoulder as he opened the manila folder. The quitclaim deed was already positioned on the desk, looking stark and lethal under the recessed lighting. I reached into my jacket pocket ostensibly to find a handkerchief and secretly pressed the record button on the digital device Sonia had provided. "The pen is right here, Dad," Julian whispered, his breath smelling of stale coffee and desperation. "Just like we practiced, for the legacy." I fumbled with the fountain pen, my hands trembling with a feigned weakness. "Legacy? Yes," I said, staring at the paper. Annette always said integrity was the only legacy that didn't rot. Thorne watched me with the unblinking focus of a predator, his proprietary air beginning to fray at the edges. Just sign the mark, Mr. Sterling," Thorne said, his voice dropping an octave into a threat. "The bank is closing the window. We don't have time for a trip down memory lane." I held the pen over the signature line, the gold nib hovering a fraction of an inch above the ink. Then I stopped. I didn't shake. I didn't mutter. I simply straightened my back, a rhythmic crack echoing from my spine as I shed the skin of the victim. The confused old man died at exactly 9:35 a.m. I set the pen down on the mahogany with a heavy, deliberate click that sounded like a hammer cocking. "Julian," I said, my voice now resonant and cold. "I've spent 40 years inspecting bridges. I know a collapse when I see one, and you're flatlining." The shock that hit Julian's face was visceral. He actually recoiled, his hands flying to his chest as if I had struck him. "Desmond, what is this?" He stammered, his eyes darting toward Elena, who had gone as pale as the marble in the lobby. I didn't answer him. I looked at the door just as it opened to admit Sonia Prescott. Sonia walked in with the authority of a high court judge, flanked by two men in dark, unremarkable suits who moved with a synchronized discipline that screamed federal law enforcement. She didn't look at the view. She walked straight to the desk and placed the heavy leather-bound Heritage Trust folder right on top of the fraudulent deed. "This property belongs to a community land trust, Mr. Thorne." Sonia stated, her voice cutting through the room's pressurized silence like a diamond on glass. "It has since 8 years ago. Any attempt to transfer or leverage it constitutes bank fraud, wire fraud, and racketeering under the RICO statutes." Julian's skin turned a sickly, translucent gray. He looked at the trust folder as if it were a bomb, realizing he had been trying to sell a ghost for money he'd already gambled away. Have you ever seen a $1 million ego shatter? It sounds like absolute silence. Thorne's predatory air vanished instantly, replaced by a calculating, lethal fury. He turned toward Julian, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You little worm," he hissed. "You brought me a haunted asset. You swore this was free and clear." My heart wasn't racing. For the first time in weeks, it was beating with the steady rhythm of justice. Thorne's own legal counsel emerged from a side door, their eyes widening as they scanned the irrevocable clauses Annette had drafted to protect us from this exact moment. They whispered to Thorne, their faces grim, explicitly stating that moving forward would invite a federal investigation they couldn't bury. Thorne stood up and moved toward Julian, his hand landing on my son's shoulder, not in comfort, but in a gesture of total abandonment. "We're done here," Thorne said, his voice flat. "Julian, you lied to me. I don't deal with amateurs who bring the feds into my office." Silas, wait, I can explain." Julian started, but the notary stood up and closed his briefcase with a sharp metallic click. Sonia smiled, then a look that was more clinical than kind. "Actually, Julian, the notary you arranged is currently in federal custody," Sonia revealed. "This gentleman is an undercover agent who has recorded every second of this attempted signing." The trap had closed, and as Thorne's lawyer looked at me with a respect that felt like cold steel, I knew the foundation had finally been cleared of the rot. The heavy oak doors of the executive suite didn't just open. They were filled by the presence of 4 men in windbreakers, with federal emblazoned across their backs, and for the first time in my life, I saw my son look smaller than the chair he was sitting in. The sound of their synchronized footsteps on the sound-dampening carpet was a rhythmic punctuation to the end of a long structural failure. I watched with clinical detachment as the lead agent presented a series of warrants to Julian and Silas Thorne. The agents began an immediate asset preservation, freezing every account, every offshore shell, and every venture capital fund Julian had built on the foundation of our family's home. Julian tried to stammer a defense, his voice a high, thin reed in the wind, but Sonia Prescott moved forward and handed over the digital recorder I had used. The small red light on the device was still blinking like a beating heart, containing the real-time confession of Julian's attempted fraud. Julian looked at me, his eyes wide and leaking with a desperate hollow hope. "Dad, tell them. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Please," he whispered. I didn't look away, but I didn't offer a hand either. I looked at him with the same observant eye I used for a rusted suspension cable, seeing the rot that had gone too deep for any patch to fix. The handcuffs didn't make a sound, but they were the loudest thing in the room. Silas Thorne remained seated, his face a mask of iron, but I saw the way his fingers twitched against the mahogany desk. He was a shark that had finally found a net he couldn't bite through. I felt the taste of copper in my mouth from the residual adrenaline, but my heart was beginning to find a steady, calm rhythm for the first time in weeks. As the room descended into the chaos of seizure and interrogation, I watched Elena's realization take hold. She didn't look at the handcuffs or the agents. She looked at her phone, watching her lifestyle being liquidated in real time. Instead of defending Julian, she immediately retreated to the far window, adjusted her hair, and began recording a tearful statement. I had no idea Julian was capable of this. "I'm so sorry to everyone who believed in us." She sobbed into the lens, her eyes never leaving the screen, to check if the tears looked authentic. "You're checking your engagement metrics while your husband is being read his rights, Elena," I said as I passed her. "That's authentic." She didn't even blink, her thumb already moving to check the upload speed as the life she knew was being packed into evidence bags. Sonia escorted me out of the office, the sound of the agents' voices fading as we reached the elevator. I left Julian behind, a man trapped in a cage of his own, still trying to explain the unexplainable to men who dealt only in cold, hard facts. When we reached the skyscraper's marble lobby, Julian stumbled out of the elevator, moments after us, his expensive shoes scuffing against the polished marble. He fell to his knees in the center of the lobby. "Elena, don't do this, we still have the Aspen trip," he cried out, reaching for her as she strode toward the revolving doors. She was already on a call with a publicist, her voice sharp and businesslike. "There is no we anymore, Julian. My lawyer will be in touch about the brand assets," she said, stepping over his outstretched hand without looking back. "Have you ever seen a man realize he's worth less than the floor he's lying on?" I stopped near the security desk, leaning on my cane and watching the scene unfold. Julian was a heap of silk and desperation on the floor, a man who had sold his soul for a seat at a table that had just been folded and put away. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a $100 bill, handing it to the lobby security guard. "Do me a favor, son," I said, my voice calm and firm. "Keep that homeless man off the marble. It's a clean lobby." The guard looked at the money, then at Julian, and nodded with a silent understanding. I walked toward the revolving doors, the cold artificial wind from the glass panels hitting my face. Sonia followed me, her hand resting briefly on my arm, in a gesture of respect that felt like cold steel. I walked through the doors into the afternoon sun, the sound of Julian's sobbing fading behind the thick glass. The air in the city was crisp, and for the first time in years, it didn't taste like ozone and lies. I wasn't just an old man with a house anymore. I was an inspector who had seen the demolition through to the end. The bright yellow foreclosure notice taped to the mahogany front door was the only authentic thing I'd seen on this property since the day I arrived. It stood out like a warning flare against the dark wood, a stark punctuation mark at the end of a very long, very crooked sentence. I stood across the street leaning on my cane, watching the physical collapse of the empire Julian had built on a foundation of sand. It had been 2 weeks since the confrontation in Silas Thorne's office, and the structural failure of my son's life was now complete. A crew of movers overseen by federal agents and windbreakers moved with robotic efficiency, hauling out the designer furniture and oversized art that had made this place feel like a museum of vanity. Julian and Elena stood on the manicured lawn, surrounded by a pile of suitcases that looked pathetically small against the backdrop of the massive house. The sun-baked grass beneath their feet was starting to yellow, the automated sprinklers having been deactivated days ago. Julian looked physically aged, his shoulders slumped in a way that made his expensive linen shirt hang off him like a shroud. "They're taking the espresso machine, Elena. They're taking everything," he muttered, his voice hollow. Elena didn't even look at him. Her smudged mascara and a broken heel on her designer pumps gave her the look of a ruined doll. "Don't look at me, Julian. I'm waiting for my ride." She snapped, her eyes fixed on the street. I knew something she didn't. The private car she was waiting for had been hired using a credit card Julian didn't know she possessed. She had been planning her exit since before they ever tried to steal the Elm Street house, a rat preparing to leave a ship she had helped sink. Watching the mansion empty out was like watching a lung collapse, all that pressurized status escaping into the thin, cold air of the real world. As a black sedan pulled up to the curb, Elena moved with sudden frantic energy toward a hidden crate she'd kept near the edge of the driveway. I raised my hand, catching the eye of the lead federal agent on site. When the agents intercepted her, Elena's performative victimhood shattered into a shrill, jagged rage. They pried open the crate to reveal a cache of Annette's stolen jewelry and thick bands of cash Elena had siphoned from the firm's operating accounts over the last 6 months. "You think you're so smart, you old fossil, I earned this for putting up with him?" She shrieked at me, her face contorting into something unrecognizable. "Integrity isn't a salary, Elena. It's a choice you never made." I replied, my voice calm and firm. Elena's brand didn't end with a bang. It ended with a cardboard box and a pair of handcuffs as the agents bagged the evidence of her independent crimes. Later that day, I sat in Sonia Prescott's law office, the rhythmic ticking of the vintage watch acting as a heartbeat for the room. Sonia looked at me across a desk piled with folders, her expression one of clinical completion. She reviewed the final dossier I had prepared, the private recordings and digital timestamps, showing that Elena had been planning to frame Julian for the fraud months before Silas Thorne ever entered. The picture. "She thought she was the smartest person in the room, Sonia," I said, leaning back. Sonia nodded, a small, grim smile touching her lips. In a room full of mirrors, Desmond people usually forget to look at the floor. They're too busy admiring the reflection to notice the joists are rotting. She handed me a final set of papers. "There's one last detail, Desmond. Because of the trust's poison pill clause and the fact that Julian attempted to leverage a non-existent asset, he is now legally responsible for the mortgage debt on that mansion personally. Even though the government has seized the property, the debt follows the man. He's underwater for millions with no shore in sight." I stared out the window at the distant Chicago skyline, feeling a profound sense of closure. The paper trail of the rat was complete. I had ensured that while Julian faced his reckoning for the betrayal of his mother's memory, Elena wouldn't walk away with a single cent. The mansion was a shell, and Elena was a memory, but Julian was still out there, a cornered animal, with one final card to play. I felt the weight of my 70 years as I stood to leave. I had protected the orchard. I had protected the memory of the woman I loved. As I walked toward the elevator, I knew there was one more structural inspection I had to perform before I could finally go home to Elm Street. Julian sat on the rusted park bench with his head in his hands, a 42-year-old boy who had finally realized that when you burn every bridge you cross, you eventually run out of land to stand on. The gray drizzling rain of a Tuesday afternoon turned his cheap borrowed windbreaker into a sodden weight. I stood 5 feet away, leaning on my cane, watching him through the mist. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out, but I knew the architecture of his heart too well to be fooled by a sagging roof. Julian looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Dad, I have nowhere else to go. You're my father. You have to help me." He wept, his voice cracking with a desperation that was only half real. "I helped you for 42 years, Julian." I replied, my voice calm and firm as a stone piling. "I just didn't realize I was helping you dig a hole for us both." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a receipt, placing it on the bench beside him. "I've prepaid your first month at the St. Jude homeless shelter. It isn't a mansion, but it's a roof. I did it so you couldn't claim total abandonment in court, not because I have anything left to give you." Julian stared at the receipt, his weeping subsiding into sharp, jagged silence. He started to protest, claiming he was a victim of Silas Thorne's violence and Elena's greed, but I didn't let him finish. I pulled a set of damp, crumpled papers from my inner pocket, the intake forms for Shady Oaks Assisted Living that I had found in the kitchen drawer. I held them in front of his face, the rain blurring the ink, but not the intent. "You were measuring me for a room with a bolted door, Julian. I saw where you checked the box for involuntary commitment due to cognitive decline. Did you think I wouldn't find the paperwork while I was playing the part you wrote for me?" The begging stopped instantly. Julian's face twisted, the moisture on his cheeks turning from tears of sorrow to a mask of pure, ugly resentment. "You should have just signed the deed, old man," he spat. "You would have been comfortable. You would have had your little garden and your pills. Now you've got nothing but a house full of ghosts." Julian's eyes weren't windows to his soul. They were just empty storefronts after a fire. I realized then that there was no bridge back for him. The structural failure was terminal. I turned my back on him without another word, leaving the Shady Oaks brochure to flutter into the puddle at his feet. I walked toward the park exit, my steps rhythmic and certain, while Julian's voice faded behind me. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address for Greenwood Cemetery. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and fresh-cut grass as I walked through the gates. I found Annette's headstone under the shade of an old willow tree. I knelt my joints complaining and began to clear the stray blades of grass from the granite. I pulled a single yellow bridge inspection tag from my pocket, the kind I used to hang on steel that had passed the test, and placed it on the base of her headstone. The house is safe, Annette, I spoke quietly. It's officially part of the community land trust now. It's going to be used for affordable housing for the people who actually need a foundation, just like you planned. I told her about the fall of Silas Thorne and the evidence I'd given the prosecutor to ensure Elena and Julian faced their reckoning. For the first time since her funeral, the air didn't feel heavy with grief. It felt light, reinforced by the structural integrity of a job well done. I touched the cold textured granite of her name. "I'm going home now, Annette," I whispered. "To our real home." I stood up, wiping the moisture from my face, and looked at the horizon where the sun was trying to break through the gray clouds. As I reached the cemetery gate, the groundskeeper stepped out of his small stone hut. "Mr. Sterling," he called out, his voice hesitant. "Your wife? She left something with me years ago. Said I should only give it to the man who protected the bridge when the storm was over." He handed me a sealed envelope, the parchment yellowed with time, but the handwriting unmistakably hers. It was addressed to the man who protected the bridge. My fingers trembled as I took it, the weight of her love and pride reaching across the years to find me. I stepped into the waiting cab, the letter clutched to my chest like a shield, ready to see the final pieces of the reconstruction fall into place. The rhythmic industrial thud of a pile driver at 14 Elm Street sounded like the steady pulse of a heart that had finally found its rhythm again. I stood at the edge of the property, the smell of fresh-cut lumber filling the air. This ground had been a battleground for months, but today it felt like a garden in the first flush of spring. The heritage orchard remained its gnarled branches, reaching out like protective arms around the new framework of affordable community housing. I watched as the skeletal structure of what would become a community center rose from the earth, anchored by the very oak beams I had salvaged from my original woodshop. It was a literal reconstruction of my life's work repurposed for the public good rather than a private penthouse. The site foreman walked over to join me. "Building something that lasts isn't about the cost of the marble. It's about the depth of the pilings," I told him, running a hand over a reinforced joint. He nodded with a grin. "We're keeping the orchard, Mr. Sterling, every single tree, just like the trust demanded." I looked down toward the lower section of the lot, where drainage trenches were being dug through the heavy gray Illinois mud. A group of laborers in high-visibility vests worked in a slow, disciplined line. Among them, I spotted a figure that moved with a distinct, clumsy lack of grace. It was Julian. He was stripped of his tailored silk suits and luxury watches, his soft hands now encased in heavy leather gloves. He was laboring under a court-ordered community service program, a condition of his plea deal. There were no cameras here, no followers to witness his performance. There was only the weight of the shovel and the resistance of the earth. I walked down the slope until I was standing at the edge of the trench. Julian looked up, wiping a smear of mud from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He met my eyes, and for the first time in years, the predatory glint was gone. He looked exhausted, hollowed out by the physical reality of honest work. "Keep your back straight when you lift, Julian. Shortcuts are how things break." I said, my voice calm and devoid of the old anger. He leaned on his shovel, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I understand now, Dad," he whispered. He looked at the foundation he was helping to build, then back at me, a flicker of genuine realization crossing his face. Julian was finally working, not for a brand, but for his soul. It was a poetic justice that didn't require a prison cell, only a reminder of what it felt like to actually contribute to a foundation, instead of siphoning the strength from one. I left him there in the mud, knowing that the curriculum of the shovel was the only thing that could teach him the lessons I had failed to instill. I moved toward the far end of the site, where the heritage garden was already being plotted out. I thought about the liquidated assets I had recovered from Elena's secret accounts, the ones the federal agents had missed, but Sonia and I had tracked with clinical precision. I had secretly set up a small educational fund for the children of the families who would soon move into this housing. It felt right to use the remnants of a lie to fund the education of the truth. I reached the old stone bridge near the edge of the property, the very first structure I had ever inspected as a young man. I leaned against the rough sun-warmed stone of the railing, feeling the weight of the vintage watch in my pocket. The letter Annette had left for me was tucked safely in my jacket, her words of pride, a structural reinforcement for my spirit. The Chicago skyline was beginning to glow with hues of orange and purple, the glass needles in the distance no longer feeling like threats but just parts of a larger design. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of fresh pine and wet concrete. "The structure is sound, Annette. Every bolt, every beam," I whispered to the wind. I felt a profound peace, a resolution that went deeper than legal victories or property deeds. I had protected the orchard, I had exposed the vultures, and I had given my son a chance to find his own level in the mud. I pulled a carpenter's pencil from behind my ear, a habit I hadn't indulged in the 10 years. With a steady hand, I marked a small, invisible X on the underside of the bridge railing, my signature of approval, the mark of an inspector who knew that the bridge was finally structurally ready for the load. I turned my back on the construction and walked toward the horizon, the steady ticking of my father's watch, the only sound in a world that was finally structurally silent. The walk back to the road was easy, my joints no longer screaming, my heart no longer heavy. I had done my job. The inspection was complete and the foundation was holding. I look back now and realize the greatest mistake I made wasn't trusting my son. It was ignoring the small cracks when they first appeared. If my story teaches anything, let it be this. Don't surrender your voice, your dignity, or your legacy just to keep peace. I believed love alone could hold a family together, but even faith needs truth as its foundation. Sometimes even God allows us to face betrayal, so we can see clearly who we are meant to become. This is my reflection, my family revenge story, my warning wrapped inside a Grandpa Stories memory. Not all family revenge story paths lead to anger. Some lead to clarity. And not all Grandpa stories end in loss. Some rebuild what was broken. If you remember anything from this family revenge story, let it be this. Protect what matters before it's too late. Because even in Grandpa stories, the strongest foundation can still crack. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Leave a comment and tell me what would you do if you were in my position facing that kind of betrayal. I'd truly like to hear your perspective. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. A gentle note: while inspired by real-life themes, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling, and any similarities are purely coincidental.